Welcome to Lost Scrolls Archive. In the climate-controlled archives beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, there sits a fragment of baked clay, no larger than a paperback novel. Its catalogue designation reads CBS 10673. The surface bears the wedge-shaped impressions of ununiform script pressed into wet clay, sometime around 1600 BCE, in the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, then baked hard by fire that consumed the building where it was stored. The tablet is damaged, its edges broken away, entire columns of text lost to time. But what remains tells a story that has troubled scholars since its excavation in the 1890s. This is the tablet known as the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest surviving accounts of a great flood. But tucked between descriptions of antediluvian cities and divine councils, the text contains something unexpected, precise, almost clinical descriptions of weapons deployment. Not the flowery metaphors you might expect from ancient mythology, but procedural language, operational sequences, tactical terminology, technical specifications. The word for one particular class of weapons appears repeatedly, tukul, often translated simply as weapon or mace. But the texts surrounding this term describe something far more complex than a bronze club. They speak of weapons that move on their own, weapons that communicate with their wielders, weapons that, according to the clay, could level mountains and boil seas. For most of the past century, these descriptions have been filed away as poetic exaggeration, religious metaphor, the symbolic language of priest-kings, asserting cosmic authority. But what if the Sumerians were doing something else entirely? What if they were documenting as precisely as their language allowed actual arsenals from conflicts they understood to be real? What if these tablets preserve technical knowledge inherited from an older source, knowledge the Sumerians themselves may not have fully understood, but felt compelled to copy and preserve? The temperature in the museum vault remains constant at 68 degrees. The humidity never varies. The fragment sits in its protective housing, its cuneiform signs as crisp as the day they were impressed. Somewhere in those wedge marks lies information that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. Weapon descriptions that appear across dozens of independent tablets, separated by centuries and hundreds of miles, yet remarkably consistent in their technical terminology. This investigation begins with a simple question. What were the Sumerians actually describing? If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, perhaps in bed with the lights low, or in a chair as the day winds down, leave a comment about where you are and what time it is. This is a long journey through ancient clay and older mysteries. We'll move slowly, methodically through the evidence together. The tablets speak of war among gods, but they speak of it in a language that sounds less like myth and more like manual. When gods went to war, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, witnessed the birth of civilization as we understand it. Around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians established the world's first true cities in the southern reaches of this fertile plain: Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. They invented writing to track grain stores and temple inventories. They built ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that dominated the flat landscape. They developed mathematics, astronomy, law codes, irrigation systems, and a complex theology populated by beings they called the Anunnaki. The Sumerian language has no known relatives. It is a linguistic isolate, unconnected to the Semitic languages that would later dominate the region, bearing no resemblance to Indo-European tongues, sharing no roots with any other known language family. When Sumerian civilization eventually declined around 2000 BCE, the language became a sacred tongue preserved by Ardean, Babylonian, and Assyrian scribes, the way medieval scholars preserved Latin, a language of ritual, scholarship, and ancient authority. For nearly 4,000 years, the ununiform script remained unreadable. The last person who could read Sumerian died sometime in the 1st century CE. The wedge-shaped marks impressed into clay became meaningless decoration. curiosities brought back by travelers, museum oddities, the vast libraries of the ancient Near East, hundreds of thousands of tablets documenting everything from beer recipes to royal annals to theological poetry, remained sealed behind the wall of an indecipherable script. The breakthrough came in 1835, when British Army officer Henry Rawlinson began copying a massive trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun in Persia. The inscription, ordered by the Achaemenid king Darius the Great, recorded the same text in Old Persian, Elumite, and Babylonian. Rawlinson could read the Old Persian, which gave him a key to crack the Babylonian, which in turn opened the door to Akkadian. By the 1850s, scholars could read Akkadian texts. Sumerian proved more difficult. It would take until the 1890s before reliable translations became possible. What they found astonished them. The tablets spoke of gods who descended from the heavens, who established cities, who taught crafts and writing, who maintained complex social hierarchies, who fought terrible wars using weapons of such power that the land itself was reshaped. The Anunnaki appeared not as abstract spiritual forces, but as administrative rulers, beings who assigned territories, collected tributes, held assemblies, issued decrees, formed political factions, and when negotiations failed, went to war. The tablets describe these conflicts with unusual specificity. They catalog weapons by name and function. They describe tactical deployments. They record the aftermath of battles in geological terms. Mountains split, plains vitrified, cities buried under sand, populations scattered. The language oscillates between reverential and procedural, between hymn and technical, manual. In 1889, American archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania began systematic excavations at Nippur, approximately 100 miles south of modern Baghdad. Nippur was ancient, even by Sumerian standards, a holy city seat of Enlil, the Lord Wind, supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. The excavation would continue for over a decade, and eventually yield more than 30,000 uniform tablets. Among these tablets was CBS 10673, the fragmentary Eridu Genesis. Among them were copies of the Luga, the epic of Ninurta's exploits and weapons. Among them were king lists that recorded reigns stretching back before the flood, enumerating rulers who governed for thousands of years. Among them were temple inventories that listed tool dinga, weapons of the gods, as physical objects housed in temple armies. The British Museum, meanwhile, amassed tablets from Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, including the famous library of Ashurbanipal. Among these were copies of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which describes in elaborate detail the weapons marshaled by the god Marduk to defeat the primordial goddess, Tiamat. There were versions of the era epic, recounting a war god's rampage across Babylonia, using 7 specific weapons, called the Sebettu. By the early 20th century, scholars could read these texts fluently, but reading and understanding proved to be different matters. The mainstream interpretation develops swiftly and remains largely unchanged. These texts represent mythology, symbolic narratives, encoding religious truths, political propaganda, elevating the status of priest-kings, poetic expressions of natural forces, personified as deities. The weapons described in such elaborate detail were understood as metaphors: the storm god's lightning bolts, the flood as divine wrath, the mountains split by weapons as poetic imagery representing the awesome, incomprehensible power of gods. This interpretation is reasonable, methodologically sound, and consistent with how scholars approach mythology from other cultures. It fits comfortably within established frameworks of religious studies, literary criticism, and cultural anthropology. The weapons of the Anunnaki become symbols, representations of divine authority, cosmic order, the triumph of civilization over chaos. But this interpretation requires dismissing the procedural language as poetic flourish. It requires treating highly technical terminology as metaphorical embellishment. It requires explaining away the remarkable consistency of weapon descriptions across tablets, separated by centuries, composed in different cities, copied by different scribes, yet describing the same arsenals with the same operation characteristics. The Sumerians themselves left no indication they considered these accounts metaphorical. They recorded the wars of the Anunnaki in the same matter-of-fact tone they used for recording grain shipments and construction projects. They built temples to house the weapons of gods as physical objects. They composed prayers requesting protection from specific named weapons. They created rituals to appease gods whose arsenals had devastated cities in the past, and might do so again. There exists a second possibility, one that conventional scholarship largely avoids. What if the Sumerians were recording history as they understood it? What if they were preserving accounts of actual conflicts using the most precise language available to them? What if the weapons described in such painstaking detail represented technologies they had witnessed or inherited descriptions of, or maintained as sacred objects whose original purpose they no longer fully comprehended? This possibility does not require believing in gods in the literal sense. It requires only considering that the Sumerian term Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, might refer to something other than supernatural beings. It requires examining the weapon descriptions not as poetic imagery, but as the best approximations available to a Bronze Age scribe attempting to document technology far beyond their conceptual framework. The texts describe weapons that generate storms, weapons that project beams of light, weapons that operate autonomously, weapons that communicate, weapons that can be aimed at distant targets with precision, weapons whose effects persist long after deployment, rendering land uninhabitable for generations. The cuneiform signs for these weapons appear across the corpus of Mesopotamian literature with striking consistency. The Shao and Jawaz, the royal hunter and royal smiter, weapons of Ninurta, the Seven Sebettu of each with distinct operational characteristics. Marduk's arsenal of winds, nets, lightning arrows, and the Imusulu, the evil wind that filled Tiamat's body. The Milam, often translated as terrifying radiance, a weapon-like emanation that paralyzes enemies and can be deployed at range. These weapons have names, they have operational procedures, they have maintenance requirements. Temple texts describe offerings made to weapons, rituals performed to feed them, procedures for keeping them dormant. One Assyrian text describes a weapon of Nergal that must be kept wrapped in specific fabrics, stored in a sealed chamber, approached only by purified priests, following precise protocols. This sounds less like maintaining a bronze mace and more like handling something dangerous, something that requires containment protocols, something whose operational characteristics remain poorly understood, but whose hazards are well documented. The question persists: what were the Sumerians describing? The tablets sit in museums now in London, Philadelphia, Baghdad, Yale, Oxford, Chicago. They remain available for study. The ununiform can be read. The weapon descriptions can be examined. The procedural language can be analyzed. The patterns can be recognized. What emerges from careful examination is either the most elaborate and consistent mythological framework ever created, or something else entirely. Something that forces us to reconsider what ancient texts preserve and what their authors understood about their own distant past. The investigation begins with the weapons themselves. We will examine them one by one, tablet by tablet, reading the Sumerian descriptions as the scribes wrote them, following the procedural language where it leads, and allowing the patterns to emerge without forcing conclusions. The first weapon that demands attention is perhaps the strangest, a weapon that speaks, the sentient weapon. The Oxford University electronic text, Corpus of Sumerian Literature, contains a composite text designated 162, reconstructed from dozens of fragmentary tablets excavated from multiple sites across ancient Mesopotamia. The text is known by its opening line, Lugal A, or by its conventional title, Ninurta's Exploits. It dates to the early 2nd millennium B.C., though it likely preserves much older oral traditions. The epic recounts the god Ninurta's battle against the Asag, a monstrous entity dwelling in the mountains, and catalogues in remarkable detail The weapons Ninurta employed. Among these weapons, one stands apart: the Shahur. The Sumerian term Shahur translates literally as royal hunter, or that which smites thousands. But translation fails to capture what the text actually describes. The Shahur is not simply a weapon in Ninurta's possession. It is a weapon that acts as Ninurta's scout, his messenger, and in some passages his strategic advisor. The Lugal A describes the Shahur as having wings. It flies from Ninurta to distant locations, conducts reconnaissance, returns to report its findings, and offers tactical counsel. In several passages, the Shahur speaks directly, addressing Ninurta in first-person narrative, describing enemy positions, assessing threats, recommending courses of action. One passage preserved on tablets from both Nippur and Ur reads in translation, "The Shahur, the weapon which loved the Lord, obedient to its master, flew to Ninurta's father in Nibu. The Shahur said to Enlil in the shrine, 'Ikur, my king, has sent me to you. Ninurta, the son who respects his father's word, has sent me to you.' What he says is, 'An has given me the order to take responsibility for the earth, but I do not know the mountain's intentions.' This is extraordinary language. The weapon speaks. It travels independently to a distant city to deliver a message. It expresses uncertainty about strategic intelligence. It functions not as an inanimate object, but as an autonomous agent operating under Ninurta's command. Later in the text, the Shahur returns from Enlil carrying a response which it delivers verbally to Ninurta. The weapon then offers its own assessment. The mountain has become lofty. It has become proud. It has set itself up as a rival to Enlil. The Asag has seized power in the mountains. This is reconnaissance and analysis. The Shahur has gathered intelligence, evaluated the threat, and reported back with tactical recommendations. Conventional interpretation treats this as personification, a literary device making an inanimate weapon into a character for narrative purposes. Ancient literature frequently personifies objects. Swords have names and personalities. Shields speak in poetry. Arrows boast of their prowess. The Shiru is understood as an elaborate example of this tradition, a poetic flourish that makes Ninurta's mace into a quasi-divine helper. But the text does not treat the Shara as metaphor. It describes the weapon's movements with procedural specificity. It records the weapon's communications as literal dialogue. It presents the Shara's autonomous operation as routine, unremarkable, simply what this particular weapon does. Other tablets expand the picture. A hymn to Ninurta from the Earth period describes the Share as the weapon which flies in the front, which knows the mountains like a bird, which issues from the god like fire. Another text states that no god can comprehend its course. No god can turn it back from its path. The language suggests something that moves through the air independently, that cannot be intercepted or redirected once deployed, that possesses navigation capabilities beyond what other gods can match, that operates with a degree of autonomy unusual even in the divine sphere. The Sumerian word for weapon used in these texts is tukul, a general term covering everything from daggers to siege equipment. But the texts distinguish between ordinary tool and special classes of weapons associated with specific gods. The Share belongs to this special category. Weapons that exceed normal operational parameters. Weapons that require special terminology. Weapons that behave in ways that Bronze Age scribes struggle to describe within their conceptual vocabulary. What happens when a culture encounters technology beyond its explanatory framework? They use the closest available analogies. If something moves through the air, you describe it like a bird. If something produces devastating force, you invoke storms and fire. If something operates autonomously, you describe it as having will, as speaking, as making decisions. The Shiru exhibits characteristics that would be entirely at home in modern descriptions of autonomous weapon systems, independent navigation, target reconnaissance, data collection and transmission, decision-making protocols. A Bronze Age scribe trying to document such a device would have no vocabulary for electronics, propulsion, guidance systems, or artificial intelligence. They would use the language available. The weapon flies like a bird. It speaks. It knows. It decides. This interpretation is speculative. It requires reading the text against its conventional understanding. But it requires only one assumption that the Sumerian scribes were attempting to document something real, using the descriptive tools available to them. The Lugol-E provides additional details about the Shiru's operation. The weapon must be awakened before use through specific procedures. It requires a formal command structure. Ninurta addresses the weapon directly, issues orders, receives reports. The weapon can be recalled if circumstances change. In one passage, Ninurta redirects the Shahur mid-dem mission to investigate a different threat. These are not the characteristics of a bronze mace swung in combat. These are command and control protocols for something that operates at a distance, something that can receive updated instructions, something that maintains a communication link with its operator. Temple inventories from the later Assyrian period list the Shahur among sacred weapons housed in temple arsenals. These lists describe maintenance procedures. The weapon must be kept in a specific location, wrapped in particular fabrics, approached with caution. One text prescribes offerings to be made so that the Shah remains at rest. This language suggests not symbolic veneration of an abstract weapon concept, but practical containment procedures for a physical object whose inactive state cannot be assumed. The Shahru is not unique in Sumerian literature. Other gods possess similar weapons with autonomous characteristics. Ninurta himself commands a second such weapon, the Shagars, royal smiter, described with similar properties. The god Nergal possesses weapons that go forth on their own and do not return until they have drunk blood. Ishtar's weapons are described as knowing the way and needing no guidance. This pattern repeats across the ununiform corpus. Weapons that operate independently, that possess some form of awareness or decision-making capability, that can be sent to distant targets and trusted to execute their mission without continuous oversight. One hymn addresses Ninurta directly. Lord, your weapons which go forth at your command, which return at your bidding, which require no hand to guide them, which know their own paths, they are your glory. Regular weapons require a hand to guide. These weapons do not. They know their own paths. They go forth at command and return at bidding. They operate with a degree of autonomy that the text presents as exceptional, even in the divine sphere. Modern military terminology has language for such systems: unmanned aerial vehicles, autonomous weapon platforms, fire and forget munitions, loitering munitions, reconnaissance drones. A Bronze Age scribe had no such vocabulary, but they had birds, and they had the concept of obedient servants, and they had language for knowing and speaking and reporting. The Shiru presents a problem for conventional interpretation. If it is merely poetic personification, why the elaborate procedural details? Why the specific command protocols? Why the distinction between weapons that require a hand to guide them and weapons that do not? Why maintain physical objects representing these weapons in temple arsenals with strict containment procedures? If it represents an actual device, what was it? The text provides operational characteristics: autonomous flight, reconnaissance capability, long-range communication, target assessment, navigation systems beyond what gods can comprehend. These are not the characteristics of Bronze Age weapons. These are capabilities that would remain beyond human technology for millennia. The Lugol-E does not stand alone. Dozens of tablets from multiple time periods and locations describe the Shahur with consistent, operational characteristics. The weapon appears in texts, separated by centuries, yet the descriptions align. This consistency suggests either an elaborate long-running mythological tradition or the preservation of accounts describing something real, something whose characteristics remained consistent because the descriptions derived from a common source, actual observation, or inherited documentation. What happens when an ancient scribe attempts to describe advanced technology? They produce texts, like the Lugol-E texts, that sound like mythology but contain procedural details, technical terminology, and operational characteristics that cannot be explained away as pure imagination. The Shahur is one weapon. The texts catalog many others. Each deserves examination. Each presents similar interpretive challenges. Each forces the same question: symbolism or specification. The pattern continues. Arsenal of the Storm Ninurta does not rely on the Shahur alone. The texts catalogue an extensive arsenal. Each weapon described with specific names, functions, and operational characteristics. The Lugal-E and associated hymns enumerate these weapons systematically, often grouped by type or function. What emerges is not a poetic list of divine attributes, but something resembling a military inventory, a catalogue of capabilities organized for tactical deployment. The most frequently mentioned weapons after the Shahur are the Mitu, translated variously as mace, weapon, or power. But the texts describe the Mitu in terms that exceed a simple club. One passage states that the Mitu strikes the mountains and they split, that it hits the earth and it convulses, that its strike cannot be deflected. Another text describes the Mitu as producing a sound like thunder and leaving behind ground, turned to glass. Ground turned to glass. This is not typical battle damage from Bronze Age weapons. Glass formation requires temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees C sustained long enough to fuse silica. Lightning strikes can create small amounts of fallurites, tubes of fused sand, but the text describe widespread vitrification, entire battle sites transformed. Ancient civilizations had no technology capable of producing such effects on a large scale. Yet archaeological evidence confirms that such vitrification occurred. Excavations at multiple Near Eastern sites have discovered layers of fused sand and clay in contexts suggesting violent destruction. The fortress at Alala in Syria shows vitrified walls. Sections of the ancient city of Babylon contain vitrified brick. The archaeological literature treats these finds as evidence of intense fires during sackings, and indeed massive conflagrations can produce high temperatures. But the distribution patterns are often peculiar, with vitrification appearing in focused areas rather than uniform burn zones, suggesting directed heat sources rather than general conflagration. The texts describe Ninurta weapons producing exactly these effects: focused intense heat that fuses stone and sand. The Mitu is consistently associated with this capability across multiple independent sources. Ninurta also wields the Nuka, typically translated as spear or lance, but the Sumerian descriptions suggest something beyond a thrown or thrust weapon. The Shuka flies through the air, strikes from a distance, and its light is seen before its strike is felt. This sequence, light preceding impact, suggests a projectile traveling faster than sound, producing a visible signature before the target experiences the strike. The Enor appears in descriptions of battles where Ninurta engages enemies across valleys or from mountain peaks to distant plains. The weapon's range is emphasized repeatedly. One text states that no place is too far for the Fukur to reach, another that it crosses mountains without being seen until it strikes. These are not characteristics of a bronze spear thrown by hand. The maximum effective range of a thrown spear, even by a trained warrior, is perhaps 30 meters. The Bukur is described striking across miles, crossing terrain obstacles, hitting targets beyond line of sight. Temple inventories from later periods list Shukur among divine weapons requiring special storage. One Assyrian text prescribes that the Yucca of Ninurta must be kept in a sealed chamber lined with copper, approached only by priests who have undergone purification rituals and never exposed to direct sunlight. These storage requirements suggest not veneration of a symbolic object, but safety protocols for something hazardous, something that requires shielding and controlled access. Ninurta's arsenal includes the Jukul wooden weapon, though the texts make clear the weapon is not actually made of wood. The term appears to be descriptive of shape or function rather than material. The Guttor is described as bending without breaking, striking without being seen, and passing through shields and armor as if they were air. One tablet from Nippo describes a battle in which Ninurta deploys the Jikul against fortified positions, the weapon bent around walls, entering the fortress without breaking through gates. The enemy within fell without wounds that bled, their bodies whole but lifeless. This description has puzzled scholars. Weapons that pass through barriers without breaching them. Warriors killed without visible wounds. The passage is typically interpreted as poetic exaggeration or symbolic language for Ninurta's unstoppable power. But the text presents these characteristics, matter-of-factly, as observable effects of a specific weapon's operation. If we read the passage literally, it describes effects consistent with directed energy, weapons or possibly shock weapons, producing internal trauma without external damage. Modern directed energy systems, high-powered microwave weapons, acoustic weapons, certain electromagnetic pulse devices can produce exactly these effects. Incapacitation without visible wounds, effects that pass through physical barriers, non-breaching methods of attacking fortified positions. A Bronze Age observer witnessing such a weapon would struggle to describe it, a projectile that cannot be seen, a force that passes through walls. Victims who fall without bleeding. The language would necessarily sound like magic, because it documents effects beyond the technological framework available for explanation. The texts repeatedly emphasize that Ninurta's weapons need no arrows, need no stones, strike without projectiles. This suggests directed energy or force projection, rather than kinetic weapons. The weapons are contrasted with conventional arms, bows, slings, thrown spears, by noting their lack of physical ammunition. Ninurta also commands the melamu, a word typically translated as terrifying radiance or awe-inspiring luminosity. But the melamu functions as a weapon in the texts. It is described as something that can be put on, like armor sent forth toward enemies, concentrated or dispersed. Armies exposed to melamu become paralyzed, unable to fight, overcome with terror that renders them combat ineffective. One detailed description appears in a hymn to Ninurta from the Earth 3 period. Your melamu goes before you. A brilliance that blinds, a radiance that weakens the knees of your enemies. Those who face it cannot stand. Those who see it cannot think. Those who breathe it lose their will to fight. This sounds like a combination of visual disruption and possible chemical or biological effect. Something that produces both optical and physiological responses. Modern riot control agents, certain directed energy weapons, and psychological warfare technologies produce similar effects. Visual impairment, physical weakness, mental confusion, loss of combat effectiveness. The ancient Iadian dictionary compiles attestations of melamu across hundreds of texts. The term consistently appears in military contexts, described as deployable, concentratable, directional. Kings claim to possess melamu as a strategic asset. Prayers request protection from the melamu of enemy gods. Temple inscriptions warn that approaching certain divine statues will expose visitors to melamu effects unless proper protective measures are taken. This is not the language of abstract divine majesty. This is the language of documented hazard, something with known effects, something that requires protection, something whose deployment can determine battle outcomes. Ninurta, as complete arsenal, as enumerated across the various texts, includes Shahur and Shahur, autonomous reconnaissance, and strike weapons. Mitu, directed energy or impact weapon, producing extreme heat. Jukor, long-range precision projectile with light signature. Jitukul, barrier penetrating force weapon. Milamu, area effects, psychological and physiological weapon. Multiple unnamed weapons described as winds, floods, fires, the Tablet of Destinies when recovered from Anzu, a control system or command authority. These are not random attributes assigned for poetic effect. They represent a systematic, tactical arsenal. Reconnaissance, long-range strike, close assault, fortification breach, area denial, psychological operations. Each weapon fills a specific role. The texts describe their deployment in sequences that suggest tactical doctrine. Shahur conducts reconnaissance. Jukor engages at range. Mitu breaches defenses. Melamu disrupts enemy formation. Temple text from Lagash describe annual ceremonies in which priests symbolically disarm Ninurta's weapons, performing rituals to keep them inactive to ensure they remain sleeping until needed. The rituals are elaborate, spanning multiple days requiring specific offerings, precise timing, and language that repeatedly emphasizes the importance of keeping the weapons at rest. One such text concludes, "Thus are the weapons of Ninurta returned to slumber. Thus is the land protected from their fury. Thus is peace maintained until the day they must wake again." This is containment language. This is the language used for storing dangerous materials, for maintaining safety protocols around hazardous systems. It suggests practical procedures evolved through experience. Experience with what happens when such weapons are not properly contained. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of special weapon repositories in ancient temples. Excavations at Nippur uncovered sealed chambers beneath the temple complex, reinforced with unusual construction techniques, lined with copper and lead sheets. The chambers were empty when discovered, but cuneiform inscriptions on the walls identify them as storage for tukul-dinga weapons of the gods. Why copper and lead lining for storing bronze weapons? Bronze is harder than copper, and far harder than lead. The materials make no sense for protecting the weapons from damage, but copper and lead are excellent radiation shielding materials. If the chambers were designed to contain something that emitted particles or energy, copper and lead would be exactly the materials you would choose. The University of Pennsylvania excavation reports from the 1890s noted these chambers, but offered no explanation for their construction. Modern archaeological literature typically ignores them, or mentions them in passing, as ritual spaces, but the engineering is sophisticated. At ventilation shafts, drainage systems, multiple access points, sealed with heavy stone doors, all for chambers that supposedly housed symbolic objects. The weapons of Ninurta appear across centuries of Sumerian and Akkadian literature with remarkable consistency. Later, Assyrian kings would claim to deploy these same weapons in their own military campaigns, describing their arsenals as including the Mitu of Ninurta, the Tukua that strikes from afar, the Melamu that scatters armies. Were these symbolic claims invoking divine power, or were they documentation of inherited technology, weapons whose origins lay in an earlier era, but whose operation could still be achieved, or at least attempted by those who maintained the knowledge? The tablets do not answer these questions directly. They simply describe the weapons, their characteristics, their effects. They catalogue an arsenal that seems impossible for Bronze Age civilization, yet appears described with technical precision across hundreds of independent sources. The pattern extends beyond Ninurta. Other gods command similar arsenals. The weapon systems of Era require their own examination. The text survives in multiple copies from Babylon, Nineveh, and other Mesopotamian cities. Unlike many ancient texts that exist only in fragmentary form, the Era epic is remarkably complete, preserved across 5 tablets, totaling nearly 750 lines. The story concerns Era, god of plague and warfare, who brings devastation to Babylonia through a campaign of systematic destruction. But Era does not act alone. He commands 7 weapons called the Sebettu, a Semitic term meaning simply the 7. The text describes these 7 as both independent entities and a unified system. Weapons that operate collectively yet maintain individual identities, each with distinct capabilities that combine to form a comprehensive destructive force. The Era epic opens with a detailed description of how Anu, the sky god, created the Sebettu specifically as weapons for dealing with human overpopulation and noise. He fashioned the 7 of them, stationed them as flaming demons who raised chaos. They stood by the divine assembly to carry out Anu's will, to strike down mortals when their noise became too great to silence the clamor of humanity that disturbs the god's rest. This creation account is significant. The Sebettu are not born as gods in the traditional sense. They are manufactured. The Akkadian verb used is banan, which means to build, construct, create through crafting. This is the same verb used for temple construction, metalworking, tool making. The Sebettu are engineered for a specific purpose. The text continues with individual descriptions of each of the 7. They are called by ordinal numbers rather than personal names, though each receives descriptive epithets that suggest function. The first is described as the one who strikes the front, suggesting a leading element or initial strike capability. The second strikes at the sides, indicating flanking or peripheral attack. The third strikes from above, suggesting aerial assault. The fourth strikes from below, possibly ground penetration or subterranean attack. The fifth creates darkness that swallows light. The sixth releases the wind that carries death. The seventh brings the fire that does not consume but withers. These are not metaphorical attributes. The text described tactical deployment, positioning around a target, coordinated attack from multiple vectors. This is combined arms warfare, simultaneous engagement from front, sides, above, below using different weapon types, whose effects complement each other. Later in the epic, Era unleashes the Sebettu against Babylonia. The text describes their operation in procedural language. The seven advanced at Era's command. They spread across the land, positioned at the cardinal points. They coordinated their strikes, moving as one mind in 7 bodies. Where the first struck, the ground split. Where the second followed, buildings collapsed. Where the third hovered, day became night. Where the fourth drove downward, the foundation shook. Where the fifth spread its darkness, men could not see their hands before their faces. Where the sixth released its wind, breath became poison. Where the seventh blazed, vegetation withered to ash without flame. The description emphasizes several characteristics: distributed positioning, coordinated timing, diverse effects, and most significantly, collective consciousness. They operate as one mind in 7 bodies. This suggests linked control systems, operation, distributed yet synchronized targeting. One passage describes communication between the 7. They spoke one to another without voice. They knew each other's position without sight. They struck together without signal. This is exactly how modern military personnel describe worked weapon systems. Data link platforms that share information instantaneously, that coordinate automatically, without voice communication, that execute synchronized attacks without conventional signaling. The Era epic provides unusual detail about the Sebettu as effects on populations and landscapes. Cities struck by the 7 experience specific sequences of destruction. First comes the physical strike. Buildings collapse, walls split, structures fail. Then comes the darkness described as thick, pressing, smothering. Then comes respiratory distress. People gasping, choking, unable to draw clean breath. Finally comes a lingering effect. The land became empty. The survivors fled. And for years afterward, nothing would grow where the 7 had struck. This sequence, physical destruction, darkness, respiratory effects, long-term environmental damage, matches no conventional Bronze Age weapon. It suggests something producing multiple cascading effects. Initial kinetic impact, atmospheric disruption, dust, smoke, or worse, chemical or biological contamination, and persistent environmental hazard. The Sebettu appear in other Mesopotamian texts beyond the Era epic. They show up in incantation series, where priests recite formulas to prevent the 7 from being deployed. One such incantation from the Milu series states, "The 7 who were born in the subterranean water, who were raised in the bright heavens, who know the Tablet of Destinies, who fly like eagles, who strike like storms, may they stay far from my house, may they not approach my gate." The incantation reveals additional information. The 7 were born in subterranean water, but raised in bright heavens, suggesting underwater construction or storage, followed by atmospheric deployment. They know the Tablet of Destinies. They are somehow connected to or guided by control systems. They fly like eagles, aerial platforms. They strike like storms, rapid, devastating, covering wide areas. Temple rituals from multiple cities include procedures for appeasing or binding the Sebettu. One ritual from Uruk requires 7 specific offerings placed at 7 locations around the city perimeter, with prayers recited at dawn for 7 consecutive days, all designed to create a barrier the 7 cannot cross. The ritual language is defensive, not worship, but warding, not veneration, but protection against potential attack. Why develop elaborate citywide defensive rituals against symbolic representations of divine wrath. The procedures suggest practical experience with actual threats, experience that taught which preventive measures might be effective, experience codified into ritual practice passed down through generations. The Setu sometimes appear as individual entities serving other gods. Nergal, god of pestilence and war, commands them in some texts. Era acts with their assistance. They appear in the retinue of multiple deities associated with warfare, plague, and destruction. But across all these appearances, their characteristics remain consistent. 7 coordinated units, distributed positioning, diverse but complementary effects, collective operation, devastating combined impact. One astronomical text from the library of Ashurbanipal equates the SEU with the Pleiades star cluster, 7 stars that appear as a tight group, visible as individuals but functioning as a single, visual unit. The text states that, as the 7 stars move together across the sky, so do the 7 weapons move together across the earth. This may be mere astronomical symbolism, or it may suggest that the appearance of the weapons in coordinated flight resembled the clustered stars, multiple points of light moving in formation. The archaeological record contains evidence consistent with the effects attributed to the Setu. Multiple Near Eastern sites show evidence of catastrophic destruction dated to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, the periods when the era epic and related texts were composed or copied. These destruction layers show unusual characteristics: vitrified materials, collapsed structures with evidence of extreme heat, chemical signatures inconsistent with conventional fire, and in some cases, elevated radiation levels in localized areas. These findings are typically explained as evidence of intense fires during city sackings or natural disasters, or a combination of factors. But the distribution patterns are sometimes difficult to explain through conventional means. The destruction is often highly localized. 1/4 of a city devastated, while adjacent areas show minimal damage. The effects suggest focused directed application of force rather than general conflation or natural catastrophe. The Cau present an interpretive challenge similar to the Shahur. If they are merely mythological personifications of plague and warfare, why the elaborate technical descriptions? Why the procedural language of coordinated military operations? Why the detailed accounts of specific effects? Darkness, respiratory distress, persistent contamination. Why develop city-wide defensive rituals against abstract concepts? If they represent actual weapon systems, what were they? The texts describe autonomous aerial platforms, worked operation, diverse weapon effects, kinetic, chemical, incendiary, coordinated targeting, and possibly nuclear, biological, or chemical contamination, given the persistent environmental effects. Modern military terminology has language for such systems: drone swarms, coordinated autonomous weapon platforms, multi-domain strike packages. The United States military has recently developed and tested systems called worked kill webs, multiple autonomous platforms that share targeting data and coordinate strikes automatically. These systems operate much as the texts describe the Setu operating: distributed positioning, synchronized attacks, diverse weapon types, collective processing. A Bronze Age observer witnessing such a system would have no framework for understanding it, technically, but they would observe its effects. They would document its operations. They would create defensive procedures based on experience. They would preserve accounts warning future generations about these 7 weapons that strikers won. The era epic concludes with a disturbing passage. After Era's rampage destroys much of Babylonia, he finally withdraws the Setu. But the poet Kabti Alani Marduk adds a final warning. Era rested, but he did not dismiss the 7. He stationed them at the edges of the world, sleeping but not gone, waiting for the command to wake. The 7 remain, their rest troubled, their dreams violent, ready to strike again when Era grows angry, or when humanity becomes too numerous, too loud, too troublesome to the gods' peace. This suggests the weapons were not destroyed, but placed in some form of storage or standby mode, deactivated, but maintained, dormant, but capable of reactivation. Temple texts from later periods describe locations where the seven are said to sleep, places that must not be disturbed, sites where specific tabos apply. Some of these locations have been identified archaeologically. Deep beneath certain temples, excavators have found chambers with unusual characteristics, geometric precision in construction, materials not typically used in temple architecture, sealed entrances with no obvious function. One such chamber beneath a temple to Nigal at Kuthar contained lead-lined walls and a ventilation system that made no sense for storing ritual objects, but would be ideal for containing something that required isolation from the surrounding environment. The chamber was empty when excavated in the 1920s. The excavation report noted the unusual construction, but offered no explanation. The site was backfilled and remains largely unstudied today. The Setu represent a systematic arsenal, not random divine attributes. They suggest a level of technological sophistication and military coordination far beyond what conventional chronology attributes to Bronze Age civilization. They appear across centuries of literature, with consistent characteristics suggesting either a remarkably stable mythological tradition or the preservation of accounts, describing actual weapon systems whose operations were documented, remembered, feared, and transmitted through generations of scribes who copied texts they may not have fully understood but recognized as important to preserve. The pattern continues with other divine arsenals. Marduk's weapons against Tiamat demand examination. Winds, nets, and arrows of light. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, survives in multiple copies excavated from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and other sites. The most complete version comes from 7 tablets, containing approximately 1,000 lines. The text dates to the late 2nd millennium B.C., though it likely incorporates older Sumerian traditions. While the epic is primarily a theological narrative establishing Marduk as supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon, it contains detailed descriptions of weapons and warfare that merit close examination. The story centers on a cosmic conflict. Tiamat, the primordial goddess representing saltwater and chaos, raises an army to destroy the younger gods. The gods gather in assembly, terrified, unable to face Tiamat's forces. They turn to Marduk, offering him supreme authority if he defeats Tiamat. Marduk accepts and immediately begins assembling his arsenal. The text catalogues Marduk's weapons systematically. First, he fashions a bow and arrow, but these are described in unusual terms. The bow is called Kaku Lamahu, weapon without equal. The arrow is described as having a point that shone like lightning. One passage states, "He made the lightning his arrow's point. Fire he made its feathers. He strung the bow with a cord that could not break. When he drew it, thunder was its sound." This describes a projectile weapon that produces light, fire, and thunder. A weapon whose visual, thermal, and acoustic signatures all suggest explosive or energetic payload. Bronze Age bows do not produce lightning, fire, and thunder. They produce arrows made of wood, reed, and metal that fly silently until they strike. Marduk next assembles 4 winds: the south wind, north wind, east wind, and west wind. But the text makes clear these are not literal atmospheric phenomena. The winds are described as weapons. Marduk positions strategically around himself. He then creates 3 additional winds, called the evil wind, the whirlwind, and the dust storm. These 7 winds are positioned to fill Tiamat's body, to disturb her interior, to confuse her mind. The number 7 appears again, a systematic arsenal of 7 distinct capabilities. But these winds function as weapons with specific tactical applications. The text describes Marduk deploying them in sequence. The 4 cardinal winds establish a perimeter, preventing Tiamat's escape in any direction. The 3 additional winds are directed specifically at Tiamat herself, described as entering her body through her mouth, expanding within her, creating internal chaos. One passage provides disturbing detail. He sent forth the evil wind against her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow him, the evil wind entered her mouth so that she could not close her lips. The fierce winds filled her belly. Her belly swelled. Her mouth gaped wide. This sounds less like meteorological imagery and more like a description of aerosol weapon deployment, something introduced into the respiratory system causing internal swelling, preventing normal breathing, incapacitating the target from within. Marduk also wields a net called Yaparu, described as being made by Anu specifically for this battle. The net is not thrown manually. Instead, he spread the net to envelop her. He placed it before her and behind her. He surrounded her on every side. The net appears to deploy automatically, forming a containment perimeter around the target. Once Tiamat is trapped in the net and immobilized by the winds filling her body, Marduk shoots his lightning arrow. He released the arrow. It pierced her belly. It cut through her inward parts. It split her heart. Having thus subdued her, he extinguished her life. The weapon sequence is tactical. Establish perimeter wind set. Deploy incapacitating agent. Evil wind. Deliver killing blow. Lightning arrow. This is combined arms doctrine, using different weapon types in coordinated sequence to achieve strategic objectives. But the most peculiar aspect of Marduk's arsenal is the Imuhulu, typically translated as evil wind, but described in the text as something distinct from the other winds. The Imuhulu receives special attention. An entire passage describes its creation and characteristics. The Imaselu he made, a weapon never before seen. 7 winds he harnessed to it. It sucked in air and breathed out destruction. It consumed light and released darkness. Where it passed, nothing lived. Where it rested, the ground became dead. This weapon consumes light and releases darkness. It makes the ground dead where it rests. The language suggests something that affects the environment persistently, something whose effects linger after deployment, something that renders areas uninhabitable. The Akkadian term Imuru appears in other contexts across Mesopotamian literature. Medical texts describe an Imulu disease, a condition producing respiratory distress, skin lesions, internal bleeding, and often death. The symptoms described in these medical texts match radiation sickness with disturbing accuracy: nausea, bleeding from mucous membranes, hair loss, skin burns, immune system collapse. Environmental texts describe lands struck by Ayukulu as becoming barren for years, requiring purification rituals before resettlement. One boundary stone inscription from the Kassite period warns that a certain territory remains under Imukulu and must not be entered without protective measures. The territory was reportedly struck during a divine conflict centuries earlier, and the text apparently persisted across generations. If Imulu is purely symbolic language for divine wrath, why does it produce specific documented medical symptoms? Why does it create persistent environmental contamination? Why do texts provide safety protocols for approaching areas affected by Imulu? After defeating Tiamat, Marduk uses her corpse to create the cosmos, splitting her body to form heaven and earth, using her eyes to create the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, fashioning mountains from her breasts, making clouds from her spittle. This cosmological imagery has been understood as creation mythology, poetic language describing how order emerges from chaos. But there is another way to read the passage. After deploying weapons producing extreme energy release against a massive target, the environmental aftermath would be catastrophic. Mountains could rise from tectonic displacement. Water sources could form from geological disruption. The atmosphere could be altered. The text might preserve memory of actual environmental changes resulting from weapons, deployment changes so vast that they appeared to reshape the world itself. The Enuma Elish describes the aftermath. The gods gathered to look at Tiamat's corpse. They examined what Marduk had done. They marveled at his weapons. They asked him, "How did you create these devices? How did you fashion weapons beyond what we possess?" Marduk answered, "I assembled them from primordial materials. I harnessed forces that existed before creation. I shaped them for war." This exchange is telling. The other gods do not possess these weapons. They want to know how Marduk created them. He speaks of primordial materials and forces that existed before creation, suggesting technology based on fundamental physical principles, perhaps nuclear forces, primordial, perhaps harnessing energy from basic physical constants. The text then describes Marduk receiving 50 names from the assembled gods, each name representing a different aspect of his power and authority. But before the 50 names, the gods formally recognize Marduk's arsenal. Your weapon shall be proclaimed. Let them be called by name. Let them be remembered. Let their power never be forgotten. This suggests the weapons themselves were considered entities worthy of recognition, documentation, and transmission through memory. The text preserves not just Marduk's victory, but the specific means of victory, the weapons that made it possible. Later, Babylonian kings would claim to wield the weapons of Marduk in their military campaigns. Nebuchadnezzar II inscribed on his palace walls, "I am equipped with the bow of Marduk. I carry the net of Anu. I command the winds that filled Tiamat. With these weapons, no enemy can stand against me." Was this symbolic language invoking divine favor, or was Nebuchadnezzar claiming actual possession of inherited weapons, devices whose origins lay in an earlier era, but whose operation remained possible for those who controlled them? Temple inventories from Babylon list weapons of Marduk as physical objects housed in the Sagila temple. These lists prescribe maintenance procedures, describe storage locations, specify access restrictions. One inventory from the Neo-Babylonian period catalogs, one bow of Marduk, kept wrapped in 7 layers of linen, approached only during New Year festival. One container holding the net of Anu sealed with royal seal, opened only by king or high priest. 7 wind vessels kept in separate chambers, never to be opened simultaneously. These are not descriptions of symbolic religious artifacts. These are inventory protocols for potentially dangerous materials requiring containment, controlled access, and safety procedures. The Enuma Elish has been read primarily as theology, a narrative legitimizing Marduk's supremacy and Babylon's political dominance. But embedded in the theological narrative are detailed weapon descriptions, tactical procedures, and persistent effects that resist easy explanation as pure metaphor. If we read the text as preserved technical documentation embedded in theological framework, patterns emerge: energy weapons, lightning arrows, containment systems, net area, effect weapons, winds, chemical or radiological agents, imayulu, coordinated deployment doctrine, and environmental effects suggesting weapons of mass destruction. The text may preserve memory of actual conflict of such scale that it appeared cosmic, weapons of such power that they seemed divine, environmental effects so catastrophic that they appeared to reshape creation itself. The pattern continues. Another text describes a similar cosmic theft and battle when the tablet was stolen. The myth of Anzu, also called Zu in some versions, survives in both Sumerian and Akkadian, recent spanning more than a millennium. The story concerns the theft of the Tablet of Destinies, a device that confers supreme authority and control over divine forces. The myth provides unusual insight into command and control systems, tactical response to system compromise, and weapons deployment protocols when authority itself is contested. The standard version preserved on tablets from both Nippur and Nineveh opens with Anzu, a massive bird-like entity, sometimes described as having leonine features serving Enlil, the supreme god, in a position of trust. Anzu has access to Enlil's private chambers, where the Tablet of Destinies is kept. One day, while Enlil bathes, Anzu seizes the tablet and flees to his mountain stronghold. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. When Anzu flew off with the Tablet of Destinies, authority ceased, the divine offices stopped functioning. Brilliance was extinguished. Silence reigned. The gods stood frozen. This is not poetic language for political upheaval. The text describes system failure. Authority ceases to function. Operations stop. The gods, normally portrayed as active and powerful, become paralyzed. The tablet is not merely a symbol of legitimate rule. It is a device whose absence causes system-wide malfunction. The Akkadian term for the tablet is literally Tablet of Destinies or Tablet of Fates. The word Matu derives from mimu, to determine, to decree, to establish. The tablet determines outcomes. It establishes what will happen, It functions as a control mechanism. Later passages describe the tablet's capabilities. More specifically, he who holds the Tablet of Destinies controls the movement of the gods. He issues orders that must be obeyed. He decrees fates that cannot be altered. He commands the weapons that strike on their own. This last phrase is critical. He commands the weapons that strike on their own. The tablet provides control over autonomous weapon systems. Weapons like the Shahur, the Sebettu, Marduk's winds. Without the tablet, these weapons cannot be commanded. With it, Anzu gains authority over the entire divine arsenal. Enlil calls an emergency assembly. The gods gather to discuss response options. The situation is dire. Anzu, in possession of the tablet, now controls all autonomous systems. Any god who approaches him can be struck down with a single command. Enlil asks for volunteers to retrieve the tablet. Several gods refuse, explaining, "Anzu holds the Tablet of Destinies. He can decree our fate. He can command the weapons to strike us. How can we approach him when he controls the very forces we would use against him?" This is a tactical problem. How to attack an enemy who has compromised your command and control systems and gained authority over your weapon systems. Modern military terminology calls this cyber-physical attack or command system compromise. The problem is not Anzu's physical power, but his control of the system that operates weapons. Ea, god of wisdom and magic, proposes a solution. He summons Ninurta and provides specific instructions. You must attack before Anzu can speak. Strike before he can issue commands. Your weapons must not be the autonomous ones he controls. Use your hands, your strength, your direct action. Close distance rapidly. Allow no time for words. This is tactical doctrine for operating when your automated systems are compromised. Revert to manual control. Close quickly. Deny the enemy time to exploit their system access. Ninurta agrees to the mission. The battle unfolds in 3 stages. First, Ninurta attempts long-range attack using his automated weapons, likely the Shahur or similar systems. Anzu simply commands the weapons to cease function. Ninurta sent forth his weapons, but Anzu decreed, "Let the weapon return to the reed brake. Let the bowring return to the forest. Let the arrow return to the bird from which its feathers came." And so it happened. The weapons reversed. The bow became useless. The arrows fell apart in flight. This is not divine magic in the abstract sense. This is command authority, causing weapon systems to deactivate or self-destruct. Anzu can literally disassemble weapons by issuing commands via the tablet. Second attempt. Ninurta closes distance and attacks with direct force, wrestling, striking with his hands, physical combat. But Anzu uses the tablet defensively. Anzu decreed, "Let Ninurta's strength fail. Let his arms weaken. Let his legs give way." And Ninurta felt his power drain, his body grow heavy, his movements slow. The tablet can apparently affect biological systems, inducing fatigue or weakness. This suggests either physical fields affecting physiology, or possibly that Ninurta himself is partially technological enhanced, or modified in ways that the tablet can influence. Third attempt succeeds only through deception. Ia provides Ninurta with new instructions. Attack during a windstorm. Use the storm's noise to cover approach. Strike while Anzu is distracted. Coordinating defensive commands. Target the tablet directly to disable it before Anzu can issue further decrees. Ninurta follows this plan. He raised a great wind that filled the air with sound. Under cover of the wind's roar, he approached. Anzu, unable to hear, did not issue commands. Ninurta struck before Anzu could speak. He severed Anzu's wing. He seized the tablet. Authority returned to its rightful place. The battle is won not by superior firepower, but by communication, disruption, and speed of action. Deny the enemy the ability to transmit commands. Close distance before they can respond. Physically capture the control system. After recovering the tablet, Ninurta returns it to Enlil. The text describes immediate system restoration. When the Tablet of Destinies returned to Enlil's possession, authority was re-established. The divine offices resumed. Brilliance returned. The gods moved again as before. System reboot. restoration of normal operations. Authority re-established through physical possession of control mechanism. The Anzu myth appears in multiple versions across nearly 1,000 years of Mesopotamian literature. All versions preserve the same essential elements: theft of control system, system-wide malfunction, tactical problem of attacking enemy with command authority, solution through communication, disruption and direct assault, restoration through physical recovery of control device. Some versions identify the tablet itself as having physical characteristics. One describes it as heavy, requiring both hands to carry, suggesting substantial size or weight. Another describes it as shining, pulsing with inner light, suggesting a powered device. Yet another states it must be touched to function, requiring physical contact rather than proximity. These details suggest the tablet is not merely symbolic, but a physical object, with specific characteristics: substantial, possibly powered, requiring physical contact for operation, capable of transmitting commands to distributed systems, critical for maintaining operational authority over complex networks. The myth also reveals weapon system vulnerabilities. Autonomous weapons controlled by the tablet can be deactivated by whoever possesses the tablet. This suggests command dependency. The weapons are not independently intelligent, but require authorization from the tablet to function. This is exactly how modern autonomous weapon doctrine operates. Weapons that can select targets independently, but require human authorization to engage. Systems that incorporate failsafes, allowing override or shutdown through command. Authority. The Anzu myth has been interpreted as political allegory, a narrative about usurpation and legitimate authority, about the importance of controlling symbols of power, about the dangers of misplaced trust. These interpretations are valid on their own terms, but they do not explain the technical specificity of the descriptions. System malfunction upon tablet removal. Inability to use automated weapons against an enemy with command authority. Biological effects from tablet-issued commands. Communication disruption as tactical solution. If we read the text as documentation of actual events, using the conceptual framework available to Bronze Age scribes, it describes compromised command and control system, autonomous weapons, dependent on central authority, tactical doctrine for operating when automated systems are unavailable, physical characteristics of control devices, and protocols for system restoration. The pattern is consistent with previous texts. The Sumerian literature describes not vague divine power, but specific systems, technical capabilities, tactical doctrines, and operational procedures. The language is procedural. The details are precise. The weapon systems are documented across independent sources with remarkable consistency. Another account of catastrophe demands attention, one involving not theft, but deliberate deployment. The flood weapon. Two Sumerian texts describe the Great Flood that divides history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods. The Eridu Genesis, preserved fragmentarily on tablet CBS 10673, at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Atrahasis epic, which survives in multiple copies, including tablets from Sippar, dated to the Old Babylonian period. Both texts present the flood not as spontaneous divine anger, but as a deliberately deployed solution to a specified problem. The Atrahasis epic, the more complete account, opens with a description of conditions that precede the flood. Humanity has become numerous. Cities sprawl across the landscape. Human activity generates constant noise that disturbs the gods' rest. The text provides specific details. The land became extensive. The people multiplied. The land bellowed like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, "The noise of mankind has become oppressive to me. Because of their uproar, I cannot sleep." Enlil proposes a solution: reduce the human population through a series of catastrophes. The gods agree. The text then describes three preliminary attempts. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each reduces population temporarily, but humans recover. The noise resumes. Finally, Enlil proposes a permanent solution. "I will bring forth the flood. It shall sweep over the cult centers of the people. It shall obliterate mankind. Let this be done. The language shifts here. Earlier interventions are described as general afflictions. Plague spreads, rain ceases, crops fail. But the flood is described with procedural specificity. It will be brought forth, deployed, released, activated. It will target specifically the cult centers, the cities, the population concentrations. It will achieve total effect obliteration. The mechanism of the flood receives unusual attention. The text does not simply say, Enlil made it rain. Instead, it describes a sequence of preparations. Enlil commands that the bolt be drawn, the lock be opened. These terms bolt, sekiru, and lock, edlu, typically refer to door mechanisms, but the context suggests something being unsealed, something kept secured that must be opened to release the flood. The text continues, He opened the door of heaven. He released what was held above. He commanded, Let the waters held in the subterranean channels break forth. Let the fountains of the deep be opened. The waters above and the waters below were released together. This describes a two-source flood, atmospheric water above and subterranean water below, released simultaneously through some form of command that opens containment systems. The language suggests engineered release, not natural weather. Something is being opened. Something held in containment is being released deliberately. The Aerogenesis uses similar language. The flood was decided upon by An and Enlil. The boats of heaven were drawn back. The guardians of the lower waters received their command. The flood emerged. The Akkadian term translated as flood is abubu, which can mean flood, but also carries connotations of storm, deluge, cataclysm, a catastrophic water event beyond normal flooding. The term appears in weapon contexts in other texts. One hymn describes a war god's weapon as bringing abubu upon enemies. Another text lists abubu among divine weapons that can be deployed tactically. Before the flood's release, one god descends. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, opposes the plan. He cannot prevent the flood's deployment. Enlil has authority, but he can warn one human. Enki approaches Atrahasis in a dream and provides specific instructions. Build a boat, seal it completely. Bring aboard your family and representatives of all living creatures. Bring supplies for a long journey. The flood is coming. Those on the boat will survive. All others will perish. Atrahasis follows instruction. The text provides boat specifications, dimensions, construction method, sealing procedures, waterproofing techniques, loading protocol. These details suggest practical knowledge. Someone knew how to survive the coming catastrophe and passed that knowledge to someone willing to document survival procedures. When the flood is released, the description is harrowing. For 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land. The winds blew, the waters rose, mountains were covered, cities disappeared beneath the depths. Humanity was destroyed. The gods themselves became frightened at what they had unleashed. This last detail is significant. The gods became frightened at what they had unleashed. The flood's power exceeded expectations. The text describes the gods cowering like dogs, huddling in heaven, terrified by the catastrophe below. This suggests loss of control. A weapon deployed with more force than intended, producing effects beyond what planners anticipated. After 7 days, the flood subsides. Atrahesis's boat comes to rest on a mountain. He emerges, author's sacrifice. The gods, having watched the destruction, gather around the offering like flies, desperate, perhaps hungry, certainly chastened. The text describes them as grief-stricken, realizing the full consequences of their decision. Enlil arrives to find survivors. He is furious, demanding to know who circumvented his plan. Enki admits, providing warning. A heated argument follows, but ultimately a compromise emerges. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but under new conditions designed to limit population growth and noise. The gods agree never to deploy the flood weapon again. The biblical flood narrative in Genesis clearly derives from these Mesopotamian sources. The parallels are extensive. One righteous man warned. Boat specifications, animals aboard, 7 days of flooding, bird reconnaissance, mountain landing, sacrifice afterward. But the biblical account strips away the procedural details about weapon deployment, divine council authorization, and the flood as a deliberate, tactical decision. It becomes a morality tale about human wickedness and divine judgment. The Sumerian versions preserve something different: a decision-making process, authorization protocols, command to release containment systems, effects exceeding expectations, gods frightened by their own weapon, agreement not to deploy this weapon again. Archaeological evidence confirms major flooding in Mesopotamia during the mid-4th millennium B.C.E. Excavations at Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak have uncovered flood layers, sterile sediment deposits, separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. The flood layers vary in thickness from site to site, but indicate significant water inundation across a wide area. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating in the 1920s, discovered an 11-foot thick layer of water, deposited clay with no artifacts, separating Ubaid period remains from later Sumerian remains. He interpreted this as evidence of the biblical flood. More recent analysis suggests multiple flooding events over time, not a single global deluge, but the evidence confirms that catastrophic flooding did occur in the region where these texts originated. But natural flooding typically follows predictable patterns: seasonal overflow, river-course changes, storm surges in coastal areas. The Mesopotamian flood layers show unusual characteristics. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record. They span multiple cities across a wide area simultaneously, and in some cases they are associated with other evidence of catastrophe. Burned layers, collapsed structures, population decline. One possible explanation is dam or levee failure, the sudden release of massive amounts of water held behind natural or artificial barriers. But engineering on a scale sufficient to produce flooding across hundreds of miles would be extraordinary for the early Bronze Age. Another possibility suggested by the texts themselves: the waters held above and waters below are not merely metaphorical. Some have speculated about prehistoric ice dams, glacial outburst floods, or catastrophic sea level rise producing sudden inundation. The flood narratives might preserve memory of such events. Events so traumatic that they appeared to be deliberate divine attack. Events attributed to intentional deployment because their scale and sudden onset seemed beyond natural phenomena, or the texts mean what they say. The flood was deployed, something was opened, something held in containment was released. The mechanism is described procedurally: bolts drawn, locks opened, commands issued, waters released. The aftermath is described as exceeding expectations, frightening even those who authorize deployment. Whether natural catastrophe preserved in mythological framework or actual weapons, deployment documented in the language available to Bronze Age scribes, the flood texts preserve procedural knowledge, threat assessment, human overpopulation, authorization process, divine council decision, deployment command, open the locks, execution, 7 days of flooding, unintended consequences, effects exceed expectations, lessons learned, agreement not to repeat. The texts treat the flood as one weapon among many in the divine arsenal. It can be deployed. It requires authorization. It produces specific effects. It can be controlled or fail to be controlled if deployed without full understanding of its power. Temple rituals from later periods include ceremonies designed to prevent flood weapons from being deployed again. One ritual from Babylon requires annual reaffirmation of the gods' promise not to unleash Abu Abu. The ceremony includes priests symbolically sealing gates, closing locks, ensuring containment. These rituals suggest ongoing concern, not merely commemorating ancient mythology, but actively maintaining safety protocols against a threat considered still present. The flood narratives read alongside the other weapon texts, reveal a pattern: systematic arsenals, command authorization, procedural deployment, effects, documentation, lessons learned, protocols, and ongoing containment procedures. The pattern extends beyond individual weapons to encompass entire strategic doctrines. But the texts also describe physical artifacts, weapons stored in temples maintained, according to specific procedures, treated as real objects requiring real containment, physical evidence in temple archives. The question of whether divine weapons were merely symbolic or had physical manifestations finds a partial answer in archaeological and textual evidence from temple excavations. Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian temple inventories list cooking weapons of the gods as tangible objects requiring storage, maintenance, and ritual attention. These inventories describe not abstractions, but physical items with specific characteristics, storage requirements, and handling procedures. The Yale Babylonian collection preserves numerous temple administrative texts cataloging sacred weapons. One tablet from the Earth period, dating to approximately 2000 Drayden B.C.E., lists weapons housed in the temple of Ninurta at Nippur. One tra of Ninurta, wrapped in linen, kept in the sealed chamber. One tra of Ninurta, wrapped in wool, kept in the sealed chamber. 7 containers of the winds of Enlil, kept in 7 rooms, each sealed separately. The Mitu of Ninurta, which none may touch, kept behind 3 doors. These are inventory entries, not mythological descriptions. The weapons have specific storage locations. They require wrapping in particular materials. They are kept in sealed chambers. Some require multiple doors, layered security, suggesting either value or hazard. Another tablet from the Neo-Assyrian period, from the Temple of Nergal at Kuthar, provides maintenance instructions. In the month of Teshit, on the 9th day, the weapons of Nergal shall be brought forth by the high priest and 4 purified attendants. They shall be unwrapped carefully. They shall be inspected for damage. If they show no signs of deterioration, they should be rewrapped in new linen and returned to the sealed chamber. If they show signs of wear, the king shall be notified immediately. This reads like standard maintenance protocol for stored military equipment, scheduled inspection, damage assessment, reporting procedures. But these are supposedly divine weapons. Why would they require inspection for wear and deterioration? Why involve multiple attendants and priests in handling? Why notify the king if damage is detected? The language suggests physical objects that can deteriorate over time, that require careful handling, that are considered important enough to warrant royal attention if their condition changes. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the chambers described in these texts. At Nippur, the University of Pennsylvania expeditions in the 1890s and subsequent excavations in the 1950s uncovered sealed rooms beneath the main temple complex. These chambers showed unusual construction, walls built with exceptional precision, floors perfectly level, ceilings supported by complex engineering, and most intriguingly, walls lined with sheets of copper and lead. The excavation reports noted this unusual feature, but offered no convincing explanation. Copper and lead serve no obvious purpose in ritual spaces. Bronze Age temples typically used mud brick, fired brick, stone, or wood, not metal linings in underground chambers, but copper and lead are excellent materials for radiation shielding, electromagnetic isolation, or containment of materials that might contaminate surrounding areas. The chambers were empty when excavated. Whatever they once contained had been removed, either by ancient priests when the city was abandoned, by lutters in the centuries since, or by excavators who did not recognize the significance of what they found. But the architectural features remain: precision engineering, metal linings, sophisticated ventilation systems, multiple sealed doors, all for storing objects. The texts identify as weapons of gods. Similar chambers have been found at Ur, Uruk, Babylon, and Ashur. Each shows comparable construction techniques: underground location, precision architecture, metal linings, ventilation systems, controlled access. At Babylon, excavations beneath the Esagila temple revealed a chamber with lead-lined walls 3 meters thick. Extraordinary overkill for storing bronze weapons or religious artifacts, but sensible shielding for containing something emitting particles or energy. Physical weapons have been excavated from Mesopotamian temples, though typically from outer chambers and general storage areas, rather than the deep sealed chambers. These include ceremonial maces, axes with unusual mythology, daggers with inscriptions dedicating them to specific gods, and composite weapons combining metal with materials like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and meteoric iron. One such weapon excavated from the Temple of Inanna at Uruk, and now in the British Museum catalogue, number BM424, is described in excavation reports as a ceremonial mace head. It is made from an unidentified dark stone with unusual density and magnetic properties. The stone has never been conclusively identified. Metallurgical analysis revealed trace elements inconsistent with known ancient alloys. The object is perfectly balanced, despite irregular appearance, suggesting engineering beyond what is typically attributed to 3rd millennium BCE craftsmanship. The museum catalogue describes it as cult object, probably non-functional symbolic weapon dedicated to goddess Inanna. But why would a symbolic object require such sophisticated engineering? Why use materials whose properties exceed practical necessity? Why dedicate extreme precision to an object meant only for ritual display? Another curious find comes from Nimrod, the Neo-Assyrian capital. During excavations in the 1950s, archaeologists discovered in a temple storage area 7 identical bronze objects, each about 30 centimeters long, cylindrical with capped ends, hollow, and bearing ununiform inscriptions identifying them as the 7 that strike together. The excavation director noted they resembled containers or canisters rather than weapons, but their designation in the inscription clearly identified them as weaponry. The cylinders have never been opened. Museum conservation policy prohibits invasive examination without clear justification. They remain in storage at the British Museum, catalogued as ritual objects, possibly symbolic representations of divine weapons. No one has explained what function they might serve as ritual objects, why they are identical, or what they might contain. Temple texts describe procedures for awakening, divine weapons, rituals performed before weapons are deployed. One such text from Assyria prescribes, "Before the weapon of Nergal is brought forth, sacrifices shall be made for 3 days. The priests shall purify themselves. On the 3rd day, at dawn, the sealed chamber shall be opened. The weapon shall be unwrapped. Incantations shall be recited to awaken it. When the weapon responds, it shall be carried forth with all precautions. Those carrying it shall not look upon it directly. Those nearby shall avert their eyes. When the weapon reaches its destination, it shall be placed in position by the king alone." This describes safety protocols. Do not look directly at the weapon. Avert your eyes. Multiple people required for transport, but only the king for final positioning. These are precautions suggesting real hazard, not reverence for symbolic objects. One text provides a chilling detail about what happens when weapons are mishandled. An Assyrian chronicle describes an incident during the reign of Tukuli Ninurta I. In the month of Arashamna, the priests of Nergal brought forth the weapon for inspection, as prescribed, but they failed to perform the purification rituals correctly. The weapon was unsealed without proper precautions. 7 priests died within 3 days. The others suffered illness for many months. The king ordered the weapon sealed again and decreed that no one should approach it for a full year. 7 priests dead within 3 days after improper handling, others suffering prolonged illness. The weapons sealed and quarantined for a year. This sounds like radiation exposure, toxic contamination, or biological agent release, not the consequences of mishandling bronze artifacts. The text continues, "The king consulted the scholars. They determined that the weapon had not been properly put to rest when last it was used. It remained partly awakened. When the seals were broken, its power emerged unchecked. The deaths of the weapon's doing, though it was not commanded to strike, it remained partly awakened. Its power emerged unchecked when containment was breached. This describes a device with latent hazard, something that can cause harm even when not actively deployed, something requiring proper shutdown procedures to render safe. Do divine weapons exist as physical objects? The archaeological and textual evidence suggests temple inventories list them as tangible, items with storage locations. Sealed chambers with unusual engineering exist where texts say weapons were stored. Objects excavated from temples show anomalous materials and engineering. Maintenance schedules and inspection procedures treat them as physical artifacts. Safety protocols describe real hazards from mishandling historical accounts, document deaths and injuries from improper weapon handling. This does not prove the weapons functioned as texts describe, but it demonstrates that something physical existed, something requiring sophisticated storage, something potentially dangerous, something important enough to warrant extraordinary precautions and ongoing maintenance across centuries. The temple chambers remain, the inventory texts survive, some artifacts persist in museum collections, often catalogued as ritual objects without thorough analysis. The engineering is documented in excavation reports. The patterns are accessible to investigation. Whether these physical objects represent the actual weapons described in myths, or later, symbolic reconstructions, or misidentified artifacts whose true purpose has been lost, they indicate that ancient Mesopotamians treated divine weapons as real enough to require real storage, real maintenance, and real safety protocol. The question shifts from whether weapons existed to what the weapons were capable of doing. For that, we must examine the language used to describe their operation, the language of operations. When scribes described divine weapons in uniform, they did not use the poetic metaphorical language typical of hymns and prayers. Instead, they employed precise technical terminology, procedural sequencing, and operational details that suggest documentation rather than embellishment. Examining the linguistic patterns reveals a vocabulary of function, a grammar of process, and a semantic field more consistent with technical manuals than mythological narrative. The Sumerian verb narrative repeatedly in weapon contexts. The word means to place, to set, to position, but it is used specifically with weapons in ways that suggest more than simple placement. Texts describe weapons being jar-ed at locations in formations around perimeters. One passage describes Marduk's winds. He cocked them at the four quarters. He positioned them precisely so none could escape. This is deliberate positioning for tactical effect, establishing coverage, ensuring overlap, eliminating gaps. The verb choice emphasizes intentional placement, according to operational requirements. Another common verb is tum, to bring, to carry away, to remove. But with weapons, the verb takes on specific connotations: to deploy, to send forth, to dispatch. The Shahur is tum ed to enlil, deployed on a reconnaissance mission. The Sebettu are tum ed against Babylon, dispatched to attack. The linguistic distinction separates ordinary movement from operational deployment. The Adian verb hayakanu, corresponding to Sumerian haya, appears in weapon deployment sequences with systematic precision. Texts describe nyakanu of weapons before battle pre-positioning, jarkanu of weapons during battle tactical placement, jarkanu of weapons after battle post-action positioning. Each use follows consistent patterns. Subject deity verb, yanu object-specific weapon, location, precise, tactical position, purpose, stated or implied through context. This is procedural language. Subject action, object, location, intent, the components of operational orders. The term me appears in weapon contexts with intriguing frequency. Me is one of Sumerian's most complex words, typically translated as divine power, decree, cosmic principle, or attribute of divinity. But in weapon texts, me functions differently. Weapons possess me. Weapons operate according to me. Loss of me renders weapons inoperative. One text states, when Anzu seized the Tablet of Destinies, the me of the weapons ceased. They could no longer function according to their me. This suggests me represents something like operational protocols, programming, or system parameters, the principles by which weapons function. Without access to me, weapons become non-functional. Another passage described an Ninurta. He took up his weapon. He gave it its me. It awakened and knew its purpose. The weapon requires me to be given to it. Upon receiving me, it awakens and knows its purpose. This sounds like system activation, programming upload or protocol initiation.
The Akkadian equivalent term is PU, often translated as cult requirements or ritual procedures, but in weapon contexts, it carries technical connotations. Temple texts describe weapons requiring specific part for storage, activation, and deactivation. One text lists the paru of Negar's weapons. Their paru is as follows. They must be kept sealed in darkness. They must be approached only by purified priests. They must never be exposed to sunlight. They require offerings of specific materials at regular intervals to remain dormant. These paradu read like maintenance protocols. Storage requirements sealed dark. Access restrictions authorized personnel only. Environmental constraints, no sunlight. Operational status dormancy requires regular procedures. The linguistic framework treats paru as technical specifications, not ritual symbolism. Weapon names themselves encode function. The Shara W means King of 3000, or Royal Hunter names, suggesting either firepower, 3000 strikes, or targeting capability, hunting, seeking. The Shah Gazgwaz translates as King who smites, or Royal Destroyer, emphasis on destructive force. The Seven Sebettu are designated by function: first strike, flank strike, overhead strike, below strike, darkness bringer, wind releaser, fire producer. These are not poetic metaphors, but role designations within a weapon system. Each unit has specific tactical function contributing to overall mission. Marduk's winds receive similar functional names. Imulo, evil wind, but perhaps penetrating wind, or entering wind. Iltanu, north wind. Ku, south wind, with each direction and function specified. The names encode operational parameters. Procedural sequencing appears throughout weapon deployment descriptions. Texts follow consistent patterns. Authorization. Deity receives approval or issues command. Preparation. Weapon is awakened, activated, or retrieved from storage. Positioning. Weapon is placed in tactical location. Deployment. Weapon is sent forth or activated. Effect. Results are documented. Deactivation. Weapon is rendered safe or returned to storage. This sequence appears in the Share mission cycle. The SEU deployment, Marduk's battle against Tiamat, and Ninurta's assault on Anzu. The linguistic structures mirror operational doctrine. Standard procedures followed regardless of specific tactical situation. The Ardean verb, nawaru, to illuminate, to shine, appears in weapon contexts with unexpected frequency. Weapons nawaru, before striking. The mam terrifying radiance causes enemies to nawaru and then collapse. The tukur produces nawaru, visible from great distances. One text describes the weapon, nawaru, ed with brilliance. Its light was seen, then came its sound, then came its strike. This sequence, light, sound, impact, describes supersonic projectiles or energy weapons. Visual signature first. Light travels faster than sound. Acoustic signature second. Sonic boom. Physical impact third. Bronze Age weapons do not produce this signature. Arrows are silent in flight. Spears make no light. The linguistic pattern describes something generating visible energy, moving faster than sound, producing impact through more than kinetic force. The term yabatu, typically to plunder, to rob, takes on specialized meaning in weapon contexts. Texts describe weapons. G. A battle wing life. G. A battle wing breath. Gi yabatu, wing strength. The verb suggests extraction or draining, not simply killing, but removing something essential. One passage describes victims of the jukul, the weapon, gi yegi, their inner force. Their bodies remained whole but emptied. They fell like vessels from which water has been poured. This is not typical combat death. This describes a weapon that extracts something vital while leaving the physical body intact, possibly energy drain, possibly biological effect, possibly description of death from internal trauma without external wounds. Sumerian employs compound verbs that combine basic verbs into complex procedural terms. In weapon texts, common compounds include dabar, to seize nominalizer, to capture contain, kuda, to cut nominalizer, to separate, divide. Berber, to release intensive, to burst forth, zigna, to rise, rise. Intensive to elevate rapidly. These compounds appear in standardized phrases describing weapon operations. The linguistic structure suggests technical precision, not one verb, but verb combinations specifying exact operational parameters. Comparison with non-weapon texts reveals striking differences. Hymns praising gods use metaphorical language. Poetic parallelism, symbolic imagery. Historical inscriptions describing human warfare use straightforward narrative, army, marched, battle fought, enemy defeated. But divine weapon texts use neither pure metaphor nor simple narrative. They employ procedural language, technical terminology, systematic description. One scholar examining Sumerian military terminology noted, the texts describing divine weapons contain vocabulary that does not appear in texts describing human warfare. They use verb forms that emphasize autonomous action, terminology that specifies precision and control, and grammatical constructions that parallel what we might call technical specification language. If these texts are purely mythological, why develop specialized technical vocabulary? Why maintain linguistic precision across centuries of copying? Why employ procedural language structures when poetic language would serve theological purposes equally well? If these texts preserve technical documentation, the linguistic patterns make sense. The vocabulary encodes operational information. The procedural structures preserve functional knowledge. The precision ensures accurate transmission across generations of scribes who might not understand what they were documenting, but recognized its importance. The language of divine weapon texts constitutes a distinct subset of Sumerian and Akkadian literature, neither pure mythology nor historical chronicle, but something closer to technical documentation embedded in narrative framework. The vocabulary, grammar, and semantic patterns suggest the texts aim to preserve operational information about technologies whose function may have been partially understood, partially mysterious, but important enough to document as precisely as language allowed. The linguistic evidence alone does not prove the weapons operated as described, but it demonstrates that whoever composed these texts employed language designed for technical communication rather than poetic expression. They wrote as if documenting real procedures, real effects, real capabilities. Even if the capabilities described exceed what conventional archaeology attributes to Bronze Age civilization, the pattern extends into specific narrative contexts, where weapons determine battle outcomes through what appears to be tactical superiority, rather than divine fiat. Gilgamesh and the Forest Guardian. Tablet V of the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero's confrontation with Hanaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. The episode has traditionally been interpreted as mythological adventure, a hero's quest to prove his courage by defeating a supernatural monster. But close reading of weapon descriptions and combat sequences reveals procedural details, suggesting something more complex. Automated defense systems, tactical countermeasures, and weapons whose operation determines battle outcome through technical advantage rather than heroic prowess. The narrative context establishes Haba not as a naturally occurring creature, but as an appointed guardian. Enel stations Hanaba in the cedar forest specifically to protect it. Enel assigned him to guard the cedar forest, to terrify mortals. He gave Humbaba 7 terrors melum as weapons. When he roars, it is the voice of the deluge. His mouth is fire. His breath is death. Humbaba is assigned to a location. He is given specific weapons. 7. Melama. His capabilities are enumerated. Acoustic weapon. Roar producing effects like flooding, thermal weapon, fire, chemical or biological weapon, deadly breath. This reads like a sentry assignment with specified defensive armaments. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu approach the forest, they encounter the first defensive layer. They reached the forest gate. All was silent. The door stood tall. No lock appeared, yet they could not open it. This suggests a security system without mechanical components visible to Bronze Age observers. Perhaps electromagnetic locks, weight sensors, or automated defensive protocols. Enkidu, who has prior knowledge of the forest, warns Gilgamesh, this gate has defenses. If any touch it improperly, their hand will wither. The gate knows friend from foe, a gate that distinguishes authorized from unauthorized approach, that causes physical harm to those who attempt improper access. This sounds like authentication systems and automated defensive responses. Eventually, they force entry. The text does not specify how, suggesting the method might have been too complex to describe, or that the scribes preserving the narrative did not understand the specifics. Once inside, they begin felling cedars. Immediately, Hanba detects the intrusion. Haba heard the sound from afar. He said, "Who is cutting my trees? Who has entered my forest?" He set his face toward the sound and came forth in fury. Haba detects the intrusion from a distance. He identifies the specific nature of the intrusion. Tree cutting. He determines location by sound. This describes remote sensing, possibly acoustic monitoring, and rapid response to detected threats. Exactly what security systems do. The battle begins with Haba deploying his melem. Hanaba sent forth his 7 terrors against them. The first terror came upon Gilgamesh. He could not move forward. The second terror came upon Enkidu. He felt his strength drain. The third terror darkened the sky. The fourth terror shook the ground. The fifth terror brought a wind that burned the lungs. The sixth terror caused confusion that scattered thoughts. The seventh terror induced sleep. This sequence describes coordinated defensive measures. Movement restriction. Terror 1, strength reduction. Terror 2, visual obstruction. Terror 3, ground disruption. Terror 4, respiratory attack. Terror 5, psychological effect. Terror 6, incapacitation. Terror 7. These are layered defenses, each producing different effects, designed to stop or disable intruders through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu have an advantage. Shamash, the sun god, intervenes. The text describes Shamash's assistance. Shamash raised up against Hanaba 13 winds, the north wind, the south wind, the east wind, the west wind, the blast, the typhoon, the sandstorm, the freezing wind, the scorching wind, the demon wind, the cloud wind, the storm wind, and the dust wind. 13 winds deployed against 7 terrors. The winds are specified by type and apparent function. Shamash deploys them strategically. He positioned them around Haba so that he could not move forward or back. The wind struck Haba. He could not release his terrors. He could not see, could not advance. This is tactical countermeasure deployment. The winds disrupt Hubaba's weapon systems. He cannot release his terrors. His weapons are jammed or disrupted. He cannot see. His senses are blinded. He cannot advance. His mobility is compromised. The 13 winds function as electronic countermeasures, creating an environment where Hubaba's defense systems cannot operate effectively. With Hubaba's weapons disabled, Gilgamesh and Enkidu can engage in direct combat. The text describes a prolonged battle, but ultimately they prevail, not through strength alone, but because Hubaba's defenses have been neutralized. Hubaba's terrors were scattered by the winds. His power was broken. He stood defenseless. Then Gilgamesh struck him. The killing blow comes only after systematic negation of defensive capabilities. This is not heroic triumph over impossible odds, but tactical success through superior countermeasures. Shamash provides the technological advantage, the 13 winds that disable 7 terrors, allowing mere humans to defeat what would otherwise be an invincible guardian. A newly discovered fragment of Tablet 5, acquired by the Suleymaniye Museum in Iraqi Kurdistan, and published in 2015, provides additional details missing from previously known versions. The fragment describes Kimaba's terrors more explicitly. The first terror, a net that captures movement. The second terror, a pressure that crushes strength. The third terror, a darkness that swallows light. The fourth terror, a shaking that topples stability. The fifth terror, a vapor that burns from within. The sixth terror, a confusion that scatters unity. The seventh terror, a sleep from which none wake. These are not vague mystical effects, but specified operational capabilities. Mobility restriction, physical debilitation, visual disruption, structural destabilization, internal chemical attack, psychological warfare, lethal incapacitation. Each terror targets a different aspect of combat capability. The fragment also clarifies Shemash's winds, describing how they counter specific terrors. The north wind dispersed the darkness. The south wind lifted the net. The east wind cleared the vapor. The west wind stopped the shaking. The blast broke the pressure. The typhoons scattered the confusion. The remaining winds ensured Wimber could deploy no more. This is point-by-point tactical negation. Each wind counters a specific terror. The sequence suggests understanding of what each defensive measure does and how to neutralize it. This is not random divine intervention, but systematic application of countermeasures based on tactical intelligence. After Humbaba's defeat, Gilgamesh and Enkidu debate whether to kill him or spare him. Humbaba offers to serve them, to give them access to the forest, to teach them the forest secrets. But Enkidu argues for killing him. If we leave him alive, the terrors may return. We do not know how to control them. We do not know how to deactivate them permanently. The only certainty is his death. This pragmatic assessment suggests the terrors are not inherent to Haba, but systems he controls. Systems that might be reactivated if he lives. Systems whose deactivation procedures are unknown to Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The solution is to eliminate the operator rather than risk the weapons being deployed again. They kill Hanaba. The text then describes their taking of trophies. They took his head. They took his 7 terrors. They carried them from the forest. The terrors can be removed from the location. They are portable. They can be taken as spoils of war. This reinforces the interpretation of terrors as physical systems rather than mystical attributes. Gilgamesh later attempts to present these captured terrors to Enlil as tribute. Enlil is furious, not pleased. The text states, Enlil was angry that Habara had been killed, angry that his terrors had been taken. He decreed punishment for Gilgamesh and Enkidu. He said, "You have taken what was not yours to take. You have removed defenses that guard sacred places. One of you must die for this transgression." Enlil's anger makes sense. If Hanaba and his terrors served a real security function, Gilgamesh has breached a protected area, disabled sophisticated defenses, removed security systems, and carried away devices whose proper handling he does not understand. From Enlil's perspective, this is dangerous theft, not heroic achievement. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not primarily a text about weapons and technology. It explores themes of friendship, mortality, the limits of human ambition, the search for immortality. But embedded in the narrative are technical details about defense systems, countermeasures, tactical operations, and weapons that can be captured and removed from their installations. The Cedar Forest episode, read as documentation of actual events, describes automated security, systems, remote detection capabilities, multiple layered defenses, tactical countermeasures deployed by allies, systematic negation of defensive capabilities, and portable weapons that can be removed from installations. Read as pure mythology. The episode is straightforward. Heroes defeat monster guarding sacred forest. Gods punish heroes for transgression. But the procedural details resist simple mythological reading. Why specify 7 terrors with distinct functions? Why describe 13 winds as specific countermeasures? Why emphasize that defenses must be disabled before direct combat can succeed? Why note that the terrors are removable and portable? The linguistic patterns match those in other weapon texts. Technical terminology, procedural sequencing, systematic enumeration, functional specifications. The narrative functions mythologically, but the details suggest something being documented within the mythological framework. Something about real defense systems, real countermeasures, real tactical operations, preserved in the language available to Bronze Age scribes, recording traditions from even earlier sources. The pattern repeats texts that function as mythology, but contain technical details, operational specifications, and procedural knowledge that resists reduction to purely symbolic interpretation. The pattern is consistent enough across independent text to demand attention to suggest that perhaps Sumerian literature preserves more than conventional scholarship acknowledges. But what does conventional scholarship say? Any responsible investigation must examine the mainstream position thoroughly and fairly. The mainstream position. For more than a century, academic archaeologists have developed sophisticated methodological frameworks for interpreting Mesopotamian texts. These scholars have dedicated careers to learning Sumerian and Akkadian, excavating ancient sites, cataloging tablets, analyzing contexts, and building comprehensive understandings of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. Their conclusions about divine weapons and the Anunnaki represent carefully reasoned positions based on comparative mythology, religious studies, linguistic analysis, and archaeological evidence. Any alternative interpretation must engage seriously with mainstream scholarship, not dismiss it. The academic consensus treats texts describing divine weapons as mythology, symbolic narratives serving religious, political, and cultural functions rather than technical documentation of actual events or technologies. This interpretation rests on several well-supported arguments. First, comparative mythology demonstrates that personification of natural forces and technological phenomena is universal in ancient cultures. Thunder gods wielding lightning are found across Indo-European, Semitic, and other mythological systems. Storm imagery appears in Egyptian, Greek, Norse, Hindu, and countless other traditions. The Sumerian texts fit established patterns. Powerful deities control forces of nature, deploy them against enemies, and demonstrate supremacy through command over elements that terrified ancient populations. Professor Thorild Jacobson, one of the most respected Assyriologists of the 20th century, argued that Sumerian religion emerged from early agricultural societies' experience of natural forces. In his seminal work, The Treasures of Darkness, Jacobson proposed that gods personified the powers humans encountered in their environment. Enlil as wind and storm, Enki as water and fertility, Inanna as the unpredictable forces of war and love. The weapons these gods wield represent aspects of their nature. Storm gods control storms. War gods command instruments of battle. This interpretive framework explains divine weapons as poetic expressions of divine power. When texts describe Ninurta's weapons splitting mountains, mainstream scholarship sees metaphorical language for erosion, earthquakes, or military conquest. When Marduk deploys winds against Tiamat, scholars interpret cosmological symbolism, the ordering of chaos, the establishment of natural laws, the triumph of civilization over primordial disorder. Second, ancient Near Eastern kingship ideology required associating rulers with divine power. Kings claimed to wield God's weapons to act as gods, representatives on earth, to exercise divine authority in human sphere. This theological framework legitimized political power. When Assyrian kings inscribed that they possessed the weapons of Ashur or the Mam of Enlil, they asserted divine right to rule, not literal possession of magical weapons. Professor Benjamin Foster's translations of Akkadian literature emphasize this political dimension. Royal inscriptions routinely claim divine weapons as metaphors for military prowess, divinely sanctioned authority, and undefeable power. The language is formulaic, conventional, part of established rhetoric rather than a literal description. Third, linguistic analysis reveals that Sumerian and Akkadian use rich metaphorical language in religious contexts. The same words that appear in weapon texts appear elsewhere with clearly metaphorical meanings. Melum, terrifying radiance, describes not only weapons, but also the awe-inspiring presence of gods, kings, and temples. Ababu flood applies to literal water, military assaults, and overwhelming divine power. The language is flexible, poetic, intended to evoke emotional and spiritual responses rather than technical precision. Professor Jeremy Black, former director of the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at Oxford, noted that Sumerian literature employs formulaic language, stock phrases, and conventional imagery that modern readers might mistake for technical specificity but which ancient audiences would recognize as standard religious and poetic expression. Fourth, the archaeological record provides no evidence for advanced technologies in Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Excavations have uncovered thousands of weapons: bronze spears, axes, daggers, arrowheads, maces. These are well understood, cast bronze hand-forged within the technological capabilities of the period. No one has excavated energy weapons, guidance systems, or devices remotely resembling what divine weapon texts describe. The sealed chambers beneath temples, the metal-lined rooms, the unusual engineering mainstream archaeology interprets these as ritual spaces, treasuries, or burial chambers. The engineering reflects the importance ancient societies placed on religious architecture, not evidence of containing hazardous materials. Many ancient cultures built elaborate sacred spaces with sophisticated engineering, without possessing advanced technology. Fifth, the phenomenon of weapons that speak or act autonomously appears in many mythological traditions without suggesting actual artificial intelligence. Greek mythology features Talos, the bronze automaton guarding Cree. Norse mythology describes Mjolnir, Thor's hammer that returns to his hand. Celtic legends speak of magical swords that choose their wielders. Sumerian sentient weapons fit this universal pattern of mythological enhancement, making weapons into characters, giving them agency and personality for narrative purposes. Sixth, the consistency of weapon descriptions across texts might reflect not preservation of technical documentation, but stability of mythological traditions. Religious narratives are inherently conservative. Scribes copying sacred texts aimed for accuracy, preserving traditional formulations even when meanings became obscure. The consistency of divine weapon descriptions demonstrates successful textual transmission, not underlying technical reality. Professor Jean Biot, in his authoritative studies of Mesopotamian thought, emphasized that ancient scribes operated within established literary tradition. They copied, adapted, and transmitted texts as part of scribal education and religious duty. The goal was preservation of tradition, not innovation or documentation of contemporary reality. Seventh, claims about advanced ancient technologies consistently fail scientific scrutiny. When subjected to rigorous analysis, methodological studies of artifacts, excavation of supposed anomalous sites, laboratory testing of materials, extraordinary claims evaporate. The gold fillings supposedly found in ancient skulls turn out to be modern restorations. The Baghdad battery that supposedly demonstrated ancient electricity proves to be a storage vessel. The precisely machined ancient artifacts reveal tool marks from Bronze Age implements. Mainstream scholarship has seen countless fringe theories claiming ancient advanced technology, and all have failed to withstand careful investigation. Divine weapon texts, when subjected to the same skeptical analysis, appear to describe mythology, not technology. Imaginative narrative, serving religious and political functions in ancient societies, lacking modern scientific frameworks. 8. The interpretive framework of reading texts as technology documentation raises more questions than it answers. If Sumerians possessed or knew of advanced weapons, where are they? Why did civilization collapse into Bronze Age conditions if such technology existed? How did knowledge completely disappear, leaving no trace in the archaeological record? Why did later civilizations show no continuation or development of these technologies? The lack of technological continuity argues against literal interpretation. If the texts document real weapons, those weapons vanished without trace, their operational principles forgotten, their very existence erased from history, except as religious mythology. This requires extraordinary assumptions, more extraordinary than accepting that Bronze Age people created sophisticated mythological narratives using the literary and theological tools available to them. These arguments are substantial. They represent careful scholarship, rigorous methodology, and reasonable interpretation based on comparative evidence. The mainstream position is not closed-minded dogma, but considered academic consensus built on decades of meticulous work by hundreds of scholars
examining thousands of texts and artifacts. Any alternative reading of divine weapon texts must address these arguments honestly. It must explain why conventional interpretation is insufficient. It must provide frameworks for understanding texts in ways that account for the evidence, without requiring unsupported assumptions. The mainstream position's greatest strength is its explanatory power. It accounts for divine weapon texts as part of comprehensible human cultural production. It situates Mesopotamian mythology within comparative religious context. It avoids speculation unsupported by archaeological evidence. It maintains methodological rigor and skepticism toward extraordinary claim. But the mainstream position also has limitations. It sometimes treats complex texts as simple metaphor without examining why metaphor takes specific forms. It occasionally dismisses procedural language as poetic flourish without explaining why. Procedural structures appear consistently. It can be quick to label anomalous findings as misidentifications or misinterpretations without thorough investigation. The question is not whether mainstream scholarship is wrong. It is built on solid foundations and represents legitimate interpretive frameworks. The question is whether it is complete, whether texts might preserve multiple layers of meaning, mythological and theological, on surface with deeper layers encoding information that scribes themselves might not have fully understood, but recognized as important to transmit. This investigation has deliberately avoided claiming certainty. It has presented evidence, noted patterns, raised questions. The mainstream position deserves respect and serious engagement, but so do the texts themselves in all their procedural specificity, their technical terminology, their consistent descriptions across independent sources, their refusal to fit neatly into purely symbolic interpretation. The evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously. That is the nature of fragmentary texts from vanished civilizations. Certainty is impossible. What remains possible is careful analysis, pattern recognition, and willingness to consider possibilities beyond established frameworks without abandoning critical thinking. The patterns identified deserve synthesis. What the patterns suggest across hundreds of tablets, spanning more than a millennium of Mesopotamian literature, certain patterns emerge with striking consistency. These patterns do not prove extraordinary claims, but they resist simple explanations. They suggest something more complex than pure mythology, yet more grounded than ancient science fiction. They point toward possibilities that conventional archaeology has not fully explored. The first pattern concerns autonomy. Divine weapons operate independently. They navigate without continuous guidance. They select targets. They report information. They execute missions with minimal operator intervention. The Shahur conducts reconnaissance, assesses threats, delivers messages, and returns for new instructions. The Sebettu coordinate attacks without voice communication. Marduk's winds position themselves strategically. The Gu penetrates fortifications autonomously. This is not how Bronze Age weapons function. Spears, arrows, and swords require constant human control. But the texts consistently describe weapons that operate with degrees of autonomy, ranging from semi-autonomous, requiring commands but executing independently, to fully autonomous, acting on standing orders without real-time control. Modern military technology has only recently achieved similar capabilities. Autonomous drones navigate using GPS and onboard processing. Loitering munitions select targets using sensor fusion. Coordinated weapon systems share data and execute synchronized attacks. These capabilities were science fiction 50 years ago. The Sumerian texts describe comparable autonomy 4,000 years ago. The second pattern involves coordination. Multiple weapons work together as integrated systems. The Setu operate as one mind in 7 bodies. Marduk's 13 winds position themselves to trap Tiamat. Ninurta's arsenal deploys in tactical sequence: reconnaissance, long-range engagement, close assault. Humbaba's 7 terrors layer defenses that require specific countermeasures. This is not how ancient warfare typically appears in texts. Human armies in Mesopotamian inscriptions fight as undifferentiated masses. Generals command, troops obey.
But divine weapon texts describe worked operations, synchronized timing, complementary capabilities, and tactical doctrine, suggesting understanding of combined arms warfare. The third pattern concerns persistent effects. Certain weapons produce long-duration environmental damage. The Emulu renders land uninhabitable for years. Areas struck by the Setu remain barren. The flood weapon reshapes geography. Medical texts describe specific symptoms associated with divine weapons, symptoms matching modern understanding of radiation sickness, chemical exposure, and biological agent effects. Bronze Age weapons produce immediate effects: wounds, death, structural damage. They do not create persistent environmental contamination, multi-generational health effects, or geographic transformation. Yet, the texts consistently describe such effects, and archaeological evidence confirms catastrophic destruction events with unusual characteristics: vitrification, localized devastation, population collapse. The fourth pattern involves containment procedures. Divine weapons require special storage, handling protocols, safety measures, and deactivation procedures. Temple texts prescribe maintenance schedules, inspection routines, containment systems. Some weapons must be kept sealed, wrapped in specific materials, isolated in shielded chambers. Personnel handling weapons require purification, possibly decontamination. Improper handling causes death or illness. Ritual religious objects require reverence, but not engineering-level containment. Protocols. Sacred texts are treated carefully, but do not require lead-lined vaults. Religious artifacts can be damaged through mishandling, but do not kill people who touch them incorrectly. Divine weapons, according to texts, do all these things. The fifth pattern concerns specificity. Weapon descriptions are detailed, consistent across sources, and employ technical terminology. The same weapons appear in multiple texts with matching characteristics. The operational procedures remain stable across centuries. The effects are enumerated systematically. The language emphasizes function over metaphor. Mythology typically varies in retelling. Details shift, characteristics change. Symbolic elements adapt to local needs. But Sumerian weapon texts maintain remarkable consistency. The Shiru always scouts. The Sebettu always number 7 with specified functions. Marduk's Imasulu always produces darkness and persistent contamination. The stability suggests either rigid mythological tradition or documentation of fixed, technical capabilities. The sixth pattern involves knowledge transmission. Later texts reference earlier texts. Kings claim to use ancestors' weapons. Temple inventories track objects across centuries. Maintenance procedures are preserved. Safety protocols continue. This suggests not merely mythological tradition, but technological inheritance. Knowledge passed down about handling devices whose creation lies in the past. Modern parallels exist. Nuclear weapons require maintenance schedules developed decades ago. Infrastructure systems operate using specifications their current operators did not develop. Complex technologies persist through documentation, training, and institutional memory, even when original creators are gone. Divine weapon texts describe similar knowledge. Transmission procedures preserve because they work, even if underlying principles are no longer fully understood. The seventh pattern concerns tactical sophistication. Weapon deployment follows logical operational sequences. Reconnaissance precedes engagement. Defenses are layered. Countermeasures target specific threats. Weapons fill distinct tactical niches: long range, close assault, area denial, psychological operations. This reflects understanding of combined arms doctrine, force multiplication, and systematic application of military technology. Bronze Age armies employ basic tactics: formation, encirclement, siege, but divine weapon texts describe operational complexity more characteristic of modern military doctrine. Networked systems, synchronized operations, precision targeting, effects-based operations. These patterns taken together paint a complex picture. They do not prove that Bronze Age Mesopotamia possessed advanced technology. They do not demonstrate that gods were aliens or that ancient weapons were nuclear devices. Such conclusions require evidence beyond what texts alone provide. But the patterns do suggest several possibilities worth considering. First possibility: Sumerian texts preserve memory of earlier, more sophisticated civilization. Perhaps pre-flood societies achieved technological levels higher than Bronze Age successors. Perhaps knowledge was partially transmitted through catastrophic transition, preserved in fragmentary form, documented by cultures that inherited but did not fully understand. This explains consistency, actual technical capabilities being documented, specificity, details preserved from earlier documentation, and containment procedures, inherited safety protocols. Second possibility: the texts employ technical-sounding language to describe ordinary phenomena in extraordinary terms. Perhaps Bronze Age people, lacking scientific frameworks, interpreted natural disasters, weapons, and political power through theological lens. Perhaps storms became wind weapons, lightning became divine arrows, political authority became tablets of destiny. This explains why no artifacts match descriptions. They describe natural phenomena in supernatural language. Third possibility: the texts combine both elements. Mythological framework, embedding genuine technical information. Perhaps scribes preserved accounts from earlier periods, adapting them to theological narratives. Perhaps knowledge of advanced capabilities persisted in memory, transmitted through stories, preserved in texts that served religious functions while simultaneously documenting technological traditions. None of these possibilities can be proven definitively. The evidence is ambiguous. The texts support multiple interpretations. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and texts alone, however detailed, cannot constitute such evidence without archaeological corroboration. But the patterns deserve acknowledgement. Mainstream scholarship's explanations account for much, but perhaps not everything. The procedural language, technical terminology, operational details, and consistent specifications suggest these texts preserve something beyond simple mythology. Possibly memory, possibly documentation, possibly knowledge, transmission through generations of scribes who copied what they did not fully understand, because tradition deemed it important. The question is not whether divine weapons were real, in the literal sense modern readers might imagine. The question is what real knowledge, if any, these texts preserve. What were Sumerian scribes trying to document? What did they understand about their own traditions? What sources did they draw from when describing arsenals that exceed Bronze Age capabilities? Archaeological discoveries continue. New tablets are excavated. Advanced analysis techniques reveal previously unreadable texts. Anomalous findings accumulate in obscure journal. Perhaps future evidence will clarify what current evidence leaves ambiguous. Until then, the texts remain preserved in museums, translated in scholarly editions, accessible for examination. The patterns are observable. The consistency is documented. The questions persist. One final text bears examination, not for adding evidence, but for understanding how ancient people themselves viewed these mysteries. The question in the clay. The vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum maintains its constant 68 degrees. The humidity never varies. Tablet CBS 10673 rests where it has rested for more than a century. Its ununiform signs as clear as the day, fire hardened them nearly 4,000 years ago. Somewhere in those wedge-shaped impressions, pressed into Mesopotamian clay, lies a question that outlives civilizations. What were they trying to tell us? The Sumerian scribes, who documented divine weapons, did not work in isolation. They inherited traditions from earlier scribes, who inherited from earlier still reaching, back through centuries, toward sources lost to time. Each generation copied tablets, sometimes adding colophons, scribal notes explaining their work. One such colophon from a tablet found at Nippur reads, "Tablet of the Weapons of Ninurta, written and collated with ancient originals in the House of Tablets." May the one who reads this understand. May the knowledge not be lost. The scribe who wrote this lived around 1800 B.C.E. The ancient originals he references were already old to him. He copied texts whose sources extended back into periods he called ancient. He expressed hope that future readers would understand. He feared knowledge would be lost. That fear proved partially justified. The texts survived, but understanding became ambiguous. We can read the words. We struggle with what they describe. The knowledge persisted in form, but perhaps not in content, preserved as texts whose meaning remains debated for millennia later. Another coffin, this one from a tablet of the Lugal-E, found at tablet describing Shahur, weapon which flies and speaks. Copied from ancient text found in temple ruins. Original badly damaged. This copy preserves what could be read. Some passages unclear. Preserved for future scholars who may understand better. The ancient scribe acknowledged limitations. He copied what he could read from damaged originals. He recognized some passages were unclear. He hoped future scholars would understand better. We are those future scholars, and we still struggle. A third coffin from an Assyrian copy of the era epic Tablet of Error and the Seven Weapons. This composition came to Kabti Alani Marduk in dreams. He claims Isham appeared to him by night and revealed these words written exactly as he spoke. Them. The gods know if this is true. This scribe expressed skepticism even while preserving the text. He noted the poet's claims of divine revelation, but added cautiously that the gods know if this is true. He documented without necessarily believing, preserving information he found questionable but important enough to copy accurately. These colophons reveal ancient scribes' attitudes toward their own texts. They recognized they were preserving knowledge whose origins they could not verify. They acknowledged uncertainty. They hoped future generations would understand better. They copied carefully despite doubts because tradition deemed these texts important. Were they preserving history, mythology, technical documentation, or something combining all three? Did they know? The colophons suggest ambiguity existed even in ancient times. Scribes preserved what they received, documented what they inherited, transmitted what tradition valued, without always understanding fully what the texts meant. This uncertainty is honest. It reflects the reality of knowledge transmission across vast time spans. Information degrades, context is lost. Later generations inherit documents whose meanings become progressively more obscure. Yet preservation continues because someone somewhere judged the information too important to lose. Modern archaeology faces similar challenges. We excavate cities buried for millennia. We translate languages dead for centuries. We interpret artifacts whose functions are uncertain. We build frameworks for understanding ancient civilizations while acknowledging enormous gaps in knowledge. The difference is, we recognize our uncertainty as limitation. Ancient scribes recognize theirs too. The divine weapon texts present a specific category of ancient knowledge, texts that resist easy interpretation that contain procedural details alongside, mythological narrative that describe capabilities exceeding what archaeology attributes to their author's civilization, yet whose authors took care to preserve them accurately. 3 interpretations remain possible, none provable, each reasonable. The texts are mythology, sophisticated religious narratives serving theological and political functions, employing rich imagery and symbolic language to express divine power and legitimate human authority. The procedural details are poetic elaboration. The consistency reflects stable religious tradition. The technical terminology is metaphorical. This interpretation is methodologically sound, requires no extraordinary assumptions, and accounts for evidence within established scholarly frameworks. The texts preserve fragmentary memory of earlier technological civilization, societies that achieved capabilities later, civilizations lost, whose knowledge survived in degraded form through catastrophic transition, documented by Bronze Age scribes as divine mythology because they lacked frameworks for understanding advanced technology. The procedural details are partially preserved technical information. The consistency reflects documentation of actual capabilities. The technical terminology is literal description within linguistic limitations. This interpretation requires assuming civilizations more advanced than currently acknowledged but does not require violation of physical laws. The texts combine both elements: mythological frameworks, embedding genuine technical information, serving religious functions, while simultaneously preserving knowledge from earlier periods, maintained through scribal tradition that recognize these texts as important, even when meanings became obscure. The procedural details are real data encoded in mythological narrative. The consistency reflects both religious conservatism and technical documentation. The technical terminology is literal within theological framework. This interpretation acknowledges complexity, accepts ambiguity, and resists reducing texts to single-layer meanings. Perhaps certainty is not required. Perhaps the value lies not in proving what divine weapons were, but in recognizing that ancient texts preserve multiple layers of meaning, serve multiple functions, and contain information whose significance we may not fully grasp. Perhaps the responsible approach is acknowledging patterns while resisting premature conclusions. The tablets remain accessible. Museums house thousands of cuneifer texts, many still unstudied. New excavations uncover more tablets each year. Translation technologies improve. Analysis techniques advance. The evidentiary base continues growing. Perhaps future discoveries will clarify what current evidence leaves ambiguous. Perhaps they will deepen the mystery. What seems clear is that Sumerian scribes, 4,000 years ago, wrestled with texts they received from their own ancient past. Texts describing weapons they did not fully understand, but considered important enough to preserve accurately. They copied what they received. They transmitted what they inherited. They added colophons, expressing hope that future generations would understand better. We are those future generations. We have capabilities those ancient scribes could not imagine: computers that decipher languages, satellites that map buried cities, instruments that analyze materials atom by atom, frameworks for understanding how knowledge transmits across time. Yet we still struggle with what their texts mean. Perhaps that struggle is itself significant, a reminder that knowledge is always partial, understanding always incomplete, interpretation always provisional. The divine weapons described in Sumerian texts may be mythology, memory, documentation, or synthesis of all three. The texts do not answer this question definitively. They present evidence that supports multiple interpretations. They preserve information whose meaning remains debated. They pose questions that persist for millennia after the scribes who documented them returned to dust. That persistence is itself remarkable. The tablets survived fires, floods, conquests, the collapse of civilizations, the death of languages. They endured in baked clay, buried in desert sand, preserved by accident and circumstance, until excavators uncovered them and scholars deciphered them. The information they carry, whether mythology, memory, or technical documentation, proved resilient enough to survive vast spans of time. Perhaps that resilience reflects importance. Perhaps cultures preserve what matters most carefully. Perhaps the Sumerian obsession with documenting divine weapons, with maintaining temple arsenals, with prescribing containment protocols, with copying texts accurately across centuries, reflects recognition that these texts held information too significant to lose, information whose exact meaning might be uncertain, but whose preservation was considered essential. The question in the clay is simple. What were they trying to tell us? The answer remains uncertain, but the question itself is worth preserving, worth investigating, worth approaching with both openness and rigor. The texts deserve careful reading. The patterns merit attention. The possibilities warrant exploration. The mystery honors both the ancient scribes who preserved these texts and modern investigators who engage them honestly. In the Philadelphia Vault, CBS 10673 rests in its climate-controlled housing, its ununiform signs unchanged, its message as ambiguous as ever. It has survived nearly 4 millennia. It may survive many more. Somewhere in those wedge marks lies information that Bronze Age scribes considered worth preserving. Information about weapons, conflicts, knowledge, memory, and perhaps the boundaries between mythology and documentation. The tablet does not provide answers. It poses questions.
and questions pursued with care and intellectual honesty serve knowledge even when definitive answers remain elusive.
Perhaps that is enough to recognize patterns, to acknowledge ambiguity, to explore possibilities, to honor both the texts and the scribes who preserved them, and to remain open to the idea that ancient civilizations might have known, remembered, or documented more than conventional frameworks currently acknowledge. The investigation continues, the evidence accumulates, the mystery endures, and in quiet archives beneath museums around the world, tablets rest in darkness, waiting for readers who might at last understand what ancient scribes tried so carefully to preserve. If this investigation has resonated with you, if the patterns seemed significant, if the questions felt worth asking, if the mystery intrigued you, consider exploring further. The texts are accessible, the museums are open, the translations are published, the questions remain alive, waiting for minds willing to engage them seriously, rigorously, and with openness to possibilities beyond established boundaries. The scribes who copied these tablets millennia ago expressed hope that future readers would understand. We are those readers, the responsibility to investigate honestly, to think critically, and to remain open to evidence wherever it leads rests with each generation. Perhaps yours will be the generation that finally understands what the ancient scribes were trying to tell us. Perhaps the answer lies not in proving extraordinary claims, but in recognizing the sophistication, complexity, and careful documentation that Bronze Age civilizations employed to preserve knowledge they deemed essential. The question remains in the clay, and clay properly baked and carefully stored can endure, forever waiting for the minds capable of reading not just the words, but the meaning beneath them.